Chapter 320, Support arrives, all take off wall, in the Stupert waters, an outlying stretch of sea governed by Whitebeard, whose territory dwarfed that of the other emperors. Suddenly, the sky roared with cannon fire. Shells streaked down, punching through clouds before plunging into the ocean in geysers of spray. I watched 3 pirate ships, each flying a different flag, close in from both flanks on a lone vessel that appeared all but wrecked by recent fighting. On its mast flapped the tattered banner of the Ghost Hand. On deck, Kaku stood struggling to stay upright. One arm hung in a blood-stained sling across his chest, and a second bandage wrapped tightly around his waist was already soaking through. He'd clearly suffered grievous wounds. Another shell hurtled earthward, aimed straight for him. In the next instant, boom, the projectile slammed into Kaku's head. But before it could finish him, a figure sprang from the deck, soared through the smoke, and punched the cannonball in midair. It shattered into fragments that rained down around him. The man fell back onto the deck, landing in a crouch, his clothes scorched and torn, evidence that he too had just weathered a brutal battle. I blinked as he rose, unbowed. Whoever this was, he had just swung the tide of this skirmish in the Ghost Hand's favor. Bruno staggered under the weight of his armor, grit clenching his teeth as he watched the 3 Whitebeard pirate ships bearing down on them. "Kaku," he called out, voice tight. "We can't hold them off forever." Kaku, gravely wounded though he was, remained standing on deck, his eyes hard and unyielding. "Keep sailing," he ordered. "Captain Shiryu is on his way." Before another word could be spoken, a thunderous boom rocked the ship. A cannonball had slammed into the hull's edge, sending splinters flying and the entire vessel shuddering. Moments later, a drenched crewman burst from below decks, panic in his eyes. "Master Kaku," he panted. "The hull's been ruptured on the port side. Water's flooding in." Kaku's jaw tightened. "Where's Maku? Go, get him here to help seal that breach." "But sir," Bruno protested, "that's a massive hole. Between you, Gabra, and me, we're all stretched thin. If we divert Nugget, engineer number 4, the starboard quarter goes wide open." Kaku turned to him, voice low but resolute. "Then so be it. This ship will not sink, not today. We're still miles from the nearest island. In my prime, I could have flown there in 1 moon step. Now most of our men are crippled. If we go down here, they all die." Bruno swallowed hard and nodded. "Aye, Captain. I'll see to it." As the wounded pirate haggled with the incoming tide, Kaku rallied his handful of able fighters. Every plank they could brace, every beam they could buttress, would buy them time. Time for Captain Shiryu to arrive, time to reach land, and time to keep their brothers and sisters alive. The sea might rage around them, but as long as the Whitebeard flagship remained afloat, hope would not be lost. Although Bruno's door fruit lets him tear open portals in midair, its range is strictly limited. He simply can't bridge the gap between 2 distant islands. Bruno's brow furrowed, and he asked, "Do we still have time?" Kaku tilted his head, eyes narrowed. "Captain Shiryu won't be here immediately, but the nearest squad, the 3rd team, has already been dispatched. The Whitebeard pirates swarm at the slightest provocation, but so do the Ghost Hand pirates. Our network is spreading fast, while Shiryu of the Rain and the others who oversee the seas of all nations move more slowly. The teams closest to us have already set sail." Boom, boom, boom. Cannon fire rumbled through the air as several Whitebeard ships came under long-range bombardment. Their shots couldn't even reach the vessel where Kaku and Bruno stood, too far away to do any real damage. Yet the message was clear. Reinforcements were on the way, and the chase was far from over. There are a fair number of Moonstep users in the New World, but very few at the officer level, and among Whitebeard's fleet, those cadres are even scarcer. None of them dare close in on Nethan's vessel. Undeterred, Zhuoyuebu leaped alone toward Nethan's light-sailing ship. "Keep firing! Don't let up!" roared the captains on the 3 Whitebeard ships. They drew their swords in salute, while the gun crews below decks scrambled to reload. Salvo after salvo of cannon fire screamed toward Nethan's deck. But a pirate ship's artillery simply can't match the destructive power of a true warship. Even with 3 vessels working together, they couldn't deliver a crippling blow in 1 volley. Before the battle, Nethan's boat had been swift under full sail, but the bombardment shattered that advantage. Hull planks cracked open, water seeped in, and the ship lost speed. Unable to shake their pursuers, Nethan and his crew had no choice but to keep fleeing under a hail of cannon fire. 1 hour, 2 hours, the minutes dragged on like hours. Each new blast sent splinters flying and forced the crew to shore up shattered timbers. Slowly, inexorably, Nethan's ship was becoming overwhelmed by the relentless shelling. At that moment, 2 cannonballs streaked across the sky in perfect arcs and slammed into the ship, one crashing onto the deck, the other striking the mast. Bruno threw himself at the deck shot and managed to deflect it, but he had no time to react to the second. Boom! In a plume of smoke and splinters, the cannonball ripped through the upper third of the mast. Wood shards flew in every direction, the sail shredded, and the mast's top section snapped off entirely. Without its sail, the vessel lost all forward thrust. "Nicely done. Let's see them try to flee now." Mocking laughter came from the 3 ships under Whitebeard's command. On board the Kaku, panic spread like wildfire. With the sail gone, the ship would stall, and the pursuers would close in without effort. "I have to hold it together," Bruno hissed. He vaulted up onto the fractured mast, wrapping his arms around the splintered wood and pressing it against the broken trunk. His muscles trembled under the strain. There was no way he could keep it upright for long. Captain Kaku stared up at the wreckage, jaw clenched. "Bruno, you're doing great, but this isn't enough. If they catch us—" He let the threat hang in the air, and the crew fell silent, all too aware of how precarious their situation had become. After enduring a brutal sea battle and a relentless chase, both Kaku and Bruno were completely spent. Bruno, in particular, was so weak he could barely hold himself up, and with the mast shattered, their ship could no longer make more than a crawl through the water. Kaku clenched his fists in frustration, ready to give in to despair. Then Bruno, bracing himself against the broken wood, suddenly lifted his head, eyes wide. "Kaku, look!" Kaku's heart skipped a beat. He snatched the binoculars from the navigator's belt and trained them on the distant horizon. 3 dark shapes were cresting the waves. As the navigator brought the glasses to his eyes, he spotted the flags at each mast, a ghostly hand on a black field with a bold number 3 beneath it. "It's the 3rd squad of the Ghost Hand Pirates," the navigator announced, lowering the lenses with trembling excitement. It was like being dead and suddenly coming back to life. Kaku let out a long, relieved breath and peered again through the binoculars. 3 ships, he murmured, hope surging through him. Nethan stared as a massive force assembled before him. Though Fisherman, captain of the 3rd squad, was conspicuously absent, his vice-captain and the other squad officers were all battle-hardened veterans, Nethan knew well. Opposing them stood Captain Robin of the 6th Division, flanked by his vice-captain, Kaku. In the division's 3rd and 4th seats, Gabra and Bruno, along with their fellow officers, rounded out a lineup of formidable fighters. Chapter 321, Screw it! Damn it! Ghost Hand Pirates! The lookout's alarm cut through the salty wind. Scouts from Whitebeard's fleet had just spotted 3 enemy ships on the horizon, reinforcements for Nethan's prey. Nethan and his squad had pursued those vessels for hours. Victory was at hand, until now. Faces aboard the Whitebeard ships went pale. How could they regain the upper hand once fresh enemy troops arrived? "Their sails are shredded," Captain City snarled, clenching his teeth. "Finish them before help shows up." He braced himself on a pair of crude crutches. In their last clash, Nethan had crushed City's leg at the hip. That arm might mend in time, but his shattered leg was beyond saving. "Don't worry, Brother City," growled the Black Mist captain, stepping to City's side. His eyes gleamed with fury. Like City, he was one of Whitebeard's trusted lieutenants. Both had bled heavily in earlier fights against Nethan's crew. Now, despite their wounds, they readied themselves for one final, desperate strike. Steel flashed on deck as the 2 captains roared their challenge. Below them, Nethan tightened his grip on his blade. The chase had been punishing, and it was far from over. They were the late-arriving reinforcements, now in hot pursuit of Kaku and his crew. "Full speed ahead! Close the distance!" Captain Black Mist bellowed, sword raised high and pointed at their quarry. Boom! 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 Under the relentless thunder of cannon fire, the 3 pursuers thundered forward. When they fell within striking range, Black Mist lashed out. A blade of crackling blue energy sliced through the air, shearing Kaku's mast clean off. Keep up the pressure. Don't let them escape, he roared, face twisted with fury. With every swing, he unleashed another burst of sword energy. At the same time, the lieutenants on the other two ships joined in. Though none of them held the rank of captain, each was a seasoned officer under Whitebeard's banner. Respected and feared in equal measure, capable of ruling a territory anywhere along the first half of the Grand Line. Nethin's small boats were already crumbling under the relentless assault. Close-range cannon fire ripped through the hulls, while long-distance slashes and inexplicable devil fruit powers shredded whatever remained. Each impact sent splinters flying and made the deck groan as if it might collapse at any moment. Desperate, Nethin and his crew retreated to the stern, abandoning all hopes of holding off the Whitebeard pirates. Instead, they searched the horizon for their only salvation, the approaching support ship of the 3rd Division. Sweat and blood streaked their faces as they watched Bruno draw deep, ragged breaths and raise his arms toward the sky. Just as their own vessel shook violently, ready to break apart, a spark of determination lit in Bruno's eyes. "Now," he whispered, and activated his Menmenguo ability. Instantly, a door tore open in midair, its frame extending outward until it met the deck of the 3rd Division's ship. "Go, go!" Nethin ordered, voice cracking with urgency. Without hesitation, the battered survivors charged through the portal. On the other side, the door swung inward on the 3rd Division's deck, and one by one they stumbled out, bruised, exhausted, but alive. The last thing Nethin saw before the door sealed shut was the broken plank of their doomed ship disappearing beneath the waves. The deck rocked beneath them, the wind whipping salt spray in their faces. The 3rd Division's vice-captain strode up to Kaku and the others, his expression as grim as the stormy sea. "This is getting ugly," he said, drawing a steadying breath. "Do you still have the devil fruit?" Kaku nodded, drawing the strange, mottled orb from his pocket for a moment before tucking it safely away again. The vice-captain gave a curt nod. "Good. Captain Shiryu will be here any minute, and Lord Nethin has already issued his orders." Bruno, his energy spent, collapsed onto the deck with a groan. "What are his orders?" he rasped. The vice-captain's eyes drifted toward the half-submerged ship where Kaku and the others clung to life, then to the Whitebeard pirates' fleet bearing down on them. A cold smile spread over his face. Those Whitebeard cutthroats? Their ghost hand pirates crushed the beast pirates, and even shattered Big Mom's armada, all under the command of Captain Nethin, and he's not yet 30. He turned back to Kaku. "You'd best head below and rest. We'll take it from here." Climbing to the rail, he raised his voice above the roar of the wind and sea. "All hands, battle stations, prepare to engage." Kaku and the others hadn't expected the 3rd Squad's deputy captain to be so hot-headed. He'd nearly sparked a full-blown battle the moment he arrived, yet since Nethin had given the order, who were they to argue? "All right, listen up," he bellowed. "Ready yourselves for combat. Let that white-bearded old coot learn exactly what we're capable of." At his shout, the officers and crew of the 3rd Squad surged with fighting spirit. Their voices rose in a unified war cry, and hesitation vanished from their ranks. Part of their confidence came from the legend of the Ghost Hand Pirates themselves. Under Captain Nethin's leadership, they'd become the most dazzling force of this new era, so formidable they once brought down the Navy headquarters. But there was more. Lafitte had discreetly administered a mild hypnotic compound to every enlisted member across all 7 squadrons. Its sole effect was to banish fear, igniting unwavering courage in their hearts so they could fight at full, and even beyond full, strength. Now, with nerves of steel and a single-minded fury, the 3rd Squad braced for the coming clash. 3 Whitebeard ships had utterly smashed the vessel Nethin and his crew had been aboard. But when the smoke cleared, only a handful of bodies lay amid the splintered planks. Had they all managed to escape? Captain City braced himself on his crutches and peered down at the wreckage, jaw clenched in frustration. There was no sign of Nethin, Gabra, or any of the others. Beside him, Captain Black Mist wore a scowl. He'd been certain they'd eliminated their targets before any reinforcements could arrive. Yet somehow, Nethin's crew had slipped away right under their noses. Just then, a breathless lookout from Black Mist's ship came rushing up. "Captain, those ships on the horizon, they're heading straight for us. and they don't look like they plan to retreat. Through the haze, 3 sleek vessels of the Ghost Hand pirates emerged, their decks alive with movement and their cannons trained on Black Mist's fleet. Black Mist's eyes narrowed. "Damn Ghost Hand bastards," he growled, his knuckles whitening on the rail. "All right then, let's see how brave they really are, coming here to shout defiance in our faces. It looks like I've only received a single sentence. To provide a coherent, polished rewrite of the entire chapter, I'll need the full text. Could you please paste the complete chapter here? Once I have it, I'll rename Ross to Nathan, clarify his gender, and turn the machine-translated text into smooth, idiomatic English." Chapter 322, Surprising the Yonko, 4th Variation. Navy Headquarters, Fleet Admiral Sengoku's office. Fleet Admiral Sengoku, legendary hero of the Warring States period, sat behind his ornate desk, eyes fixed on a stack of dispatches. He had barely skimmed the latest battle reports when the door swung open and a breathless Rear Admiral stumbled in. "Pardon the intrusion, Fleet Admiral," the Rear Admiral gasped, bowing low. "Urgent news. Officers of the Ghost Hand Pirates have clashed violently with Whitebeard Pirates' crews in the Etwall-Stewport Sea area." Sengoku's expression darkened. Skirmishes among crews under the 4 emperors were hardly unheard of. So long as the emperors themselves stayed clear and the conflict didn't escalate, the Navy's usual policy was to observe and contain. But this involved the Ghost Hand Pirates. He knew all too well the havoc they could unleash. A few years back, Captain Nethan of the Ghost Hand Pirates, then known as Ross, had stormed Navy HQ itself, leaving chaos in his wake. If Nethan's men were fighting Whitebeards here, it was far more than a localized dispute, especially in Etwall-Stewport, deep within Whitebeard's claimed waters. What could have provoked such a bold confrontation? Sengoku rose to his full height, voice brooking no argument. "Prepare a detailed situation report immediately. Then notify Vice Admiral Tsuru, have her monitor both fleets at once. I want to know every ship's position and status." The Rear Admiral snapped to attention and hurried away. Sengoku turned back to the sealed envelope on his desk, its urgent stamp seeming to glow. He tapped his finger against the wood. The sea lanes off Etwall-Stewport were about to boil over, and this time the Navy could not simply stand by. General Jean Guo rose from his seat, his brow furrowed. "Major General, report." The Major General swallowed and stepped forward, his voice tense. "Sir, the specifics remain unclear, but it appears the confrontation was over a devil fruit." John Guo's eyes narrowed. "What's unfolding in the waters between Wano and Whitebeard's territory?" The Major General bowed his head. "Only moments ago, we intercepted word of a skirmish between the Ghost Hand Pirates and the Whitebeard Pirates. Every ship's movement is being tracked. We'll dispatch a reconnaissance fleet at once." "Do it," John Guo commanded softly. The Major General saluted crisply and hurried from the room. Once the door closed, John Guo leaned heavily on his desk, pressing his palms into its polished wood. A sharp ache pounded at his temples. Ghost Hand Nethan, again. He shut his eyes, recalling the earlier dispatch. Just hours ago, the world government confirmed Nethan's assault on Science Force Base No. 0. Every structure was razed, only Vegapunk managed to flee. He leaves ruin in his wake. In just a few hours, the Ghost Hand Pirates and the Whitebeard Pirates had clashed again, like 2 thorny dolphins ramming into each other, probing relentlessly for a weakness. The sea churned red as broadsides thundered and blades flashed under the overcast sky. 30 minutes later, a breathless Vice Admiral burst into Fleet Admiral Sengoku's office. "Admiral, I have an urgent report," he said, bowing sharply. "The Ghost Hand fleet has mobilized on a massive scale, and the Whitebeards have mirrored the move. 2 of their captains set sail a day ago. They're heading straight into conflict." Sengoku's eyes narrowed. A minor skirmish might have been contained locally, but when captains of 2 of the world's most formidable crews were involved, it threatened to spark a full-scale war. If Whitebeard's flagship went toe-to-toe with the Ghost Hand, Marine Headquarters could not stand by idly. He rose from his seat, every inch the commanding presence. "Summon a high-level council immediately," he ordered, voice calm but firm. "We must formulate our strategy before this situation spirals further out of control." "Aye, Admiral," the Vice Admiral replied, already moving to carry out the orders. As Sengoku watched him go, A charged silence say. TTL'd over the office. Every Marine in the room felt it, that the fate of the Grand Line might soon hinge on the outcome of this looming confrontation. Meanwhile, far from the Marine stronghold, in the untamed waters of the Beast Domain, a lone figure leaned against the rail of a small, creaking cutter. Salt spray plastered his dark hair to his forehead as he stared off into the distance. Why in the world did that ghost-hand brat pick a fight with old Whitebeard? He muttered, voice tinged with exasperation. He rubbed his temple, the wind tugging at his coat. This was Nethan, once merely a drifting sea rogue, now caught up in the currents of a conflict that threatened to shake the very foundations of the pirate world. And no matter how far he sailed, he couldn't help but feel the pull of those two legendary flags racing toward collision. High-level council or not, it seemed the storm was only just beginning. Chapter X, Ripples of War Scene 1, on Kaido's throne. Kaido sat cross-legged atop his twisted throne in the heart of his fortress, one massive hand idly ruffling his dark mane. Flickering torches cast long shadows across the cavern, and the low murmur of beast pirates moving about filled the air, until a deep voice cut through it all. Lord Kaido, came the respectful drawl of Nethan, a promising officer at Kaido's side. He bowed once, then met the Yonko's gaze. The Ghost Hand pirates and Whitebeard's fleet are on the brink of open war. If we strike now, we could seize every inch of Ghost Hand territory without meeting either force head-on. Kaido's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. He let the tension hang in the stale air. When at last he spoke, his voice was a low growl. You propose we feed on the spoils of others' carnage? He leaned forward, the sinews of his neck taut. That dishonors the Beast King's legacy. It's not how I do things. Nethan bowed again, unshaken. Understood, Lord Kaido, but know this, their fleets have already clashed at sea. The chaos will only worsen. Should you wish to see such a spectacle firsthand, give the word. Kaido rose, so massive that the chamber seemed to tremble beneath his weight. He stretched, hair falling across his grimace. Very well, he rumbled. Keep me apprised. If the clash between Whitebeard and the Ghost Hands proves worthy of my attention, I may just pay them a visit. With that, he turned and strode from the throne room, leaving Nethan to relay orders and prepare for whatever might come next. Scene 2. The Red Hair Plains. Far to the west, a broad meadow blanketed in tall grasses glowed in the late afternoon sun. Here the Red Hair pirates had set up camp, a long wooden table groaning under platters of roasted boar and barrels of wine. Laughter rose in boisterous waves as crew members recounted old battles and pranks pulled on rival crews. Today's feast was in honor of a rare guest, Hawkeye Mihawk, the world's greatest swordsman. Word had spread that he would soon arrive to share stories, and perhaps even spar with the red-hair captain Shanks. Yet as the hour of his expected arrival drew near, the camp's revelry began to fade. Mugs lowered to tables, voices fell hush, and the crackle of the central fire seemed unnaturally loud. Every pirate turned toward the main tent, where only the soft rustle of canvas could be heard. They all knew, whenever Mihawk stepped into camp, peace was never far behind, but neither was the promise of something greater. Shanks sat on the cliff's edge, his black cloak billowing in the sea breeze as he faced the endless horizon. His gaze was deep and unreadable as he listened to his subordinate's report. Behind him, Beckman lounged on a weathered rock, cigarette glowing at his fingertips. He exhaled slowly before speaking. Judging by the current situation, a major clash is all but guaranteed. Beckman tapped ash into the wind. One devil fruit isn't enough to scare off the four emperors, unless it's something truly extraordinary, like the thunder fruit. If either side were willing to back down, this could end before it really. Lee begins, but neither Ghost Hand Nethan nor Whitebeard will yield. Once both refuse to stand down, an imperial war is inevitable. Legilu, standing nearby, chewed thoughtfully on a chunk of dried meat. So what's our move, boss? He asked, swiping at crumbs with his sleeve. Shanks bowed his head for a moment, eyes closing as if weighing every option. Then he looked up, his expression hardening. He rose slowly, wrapping his cloak around his shoulders. We go, he announced, voice low but resolute. Legilu swallowed and grinned. Well, that sounds like we're heading into a fight. Beckman flicked his cigarette butt away and stood, the ember glowing briefly before fading. He studied Shanks for a heartbeat, then added, That all depends on how far things spiral out of control. The Navy won't just watch from the sidelines, and Kaido won't stand idle if this blows up. As for Ghost Hand Nethan, he trailed off, the warning hanging in the salt-tinged air. Shanks gave a single nod, eyes fixed on the endless sea. The coming storm was on the verge of breaking. No one yet knew how many ships it would sink. Hawkeye sat a few yards away, head bowed as if lost in thought. Across the deck, Shanks couldn't help but notice his unusual silence. After a moment, Hawkeye spoke, his voice low and measured. "You remember Nethan?" Shanks glanced at him in mild surprise. "Nethan? The kid we met on the Isle of Lawlessness?" Hawkeye nodded. That night, a swordsman challenged him, one of Qingjiao's men. Nethan took the fight and won outright. I watched from the shadows, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Shanks folded his arms. I didn't either. A single encounter on that wretched island means little, or so I thought. Hawkeye stood and shook his head. It was more than a fluke. Back then, he was just scraping by. No rank, no reputation. And now look at him, one of the 4 emperors. Shanks let out a low chuckle. Who'd have guessed? The boy we passed off as a nobody has risen that fast. Fate has a twisted sense of humor. Hawkeye allowed himself a rare grin. He earned it. I just wish I'd taken notice sooner. Shanks shrugged and offered him a conspiratorial smile. Well, what do you say? Shall we pay our respects, or maybe see how our old rival has changed? Hawkeye's eyes gleamed. Let's go. Together they headed toward the Grand Hall, 2 legends drawn by the name of a man who had once been little more than a passing memory, but now stood among the kings of the seas. Hawkeye paused, watching the restless sea. If the world government decides to call us into the Grand Line, he said at last, I wouldn't mind catching a lift on the wind. A few hours later, word of the clash between the Ghost Hand pirates and the Whitebeard pirates tore through every ocean at lightning speed. From the smallest fishing hamlet to the mightiest naval stronghold, news traveled like wildfire. The entire world held its breath. Anyone with ties to either Whitebeard or the Ghost Hand crew was suddenly on edge. The fall of the Big Mom pirates was still a fresh wound, and the underworld's great reshuffle had thrown every corner of the globe into chaos. Now, this new conflict threatened to unleash an even larger storm. Chapter 3 and 23, Foil Vista, Part 1. At Atwal, in the waters off Stuport, the Ghost Hand pirates' fleet, backed by the 3rd Support Squadron and several of Whitebeard's allied crews, including the City Brigade and the Black Mist Company, was locked in a merciless engagement. Over the last 4 hours, both sides had paid dearly. 2 of the 6 ships had been reduced to splintered wrecks by cannon fire and boarding actions, and the 4 remaining vessels groaned under the ceaseless assault. On deck, amid the acrid smoke of burning rope and the crash of steel, Bruno sprang back into the fray. He drove a fierce kick into an opponent's knee and immediately followed with a sweeping strike that sent the man sprawling. The soldier managed to angle his sword against the blow, but the force of Bruno's attack knocked him back several paces, blade clattering against the deck. Everyone was running on pure willpower now. Except for Kaku, who lay grievously wounded below decks, Bruno and the others had forced themselves back into battle after snatching a few moments to eat and drink. They all wondered the same thing. How much longer could they hold? From the shadows of a torn sail stepped a Black Mist lieutenant, his lips curling in contempt as he sized up the exhausted fighters. You think you can snatch our prize without paying a price? You'll bleed for every inch. With that, he launched himself at Bruno, sword whirling in a deadly arc. Bruno's eyes snapped shut for an instant. Then he brought his forearms together in a solid iron-hard block. Steel rang against bone as the lieutenant's blade slammed home, and the battle surged onward. Nethan's domineering armor and the Navy 6 iron block technique flared to life at the same instant. He met his opponent's sword with an explosive parry, then drove forward with a vicious kick that sent the man stumbling back. Had he not already endured dozens of brutal skirmishes, had his raw power and the domineering armor not been fully honed, this enemy cadre might have overwhelmed him. Now, however, Nethan held the advantage. Across the deck, the 3rd Squad's vice captain was locking blades with the 2 Ghost Hand pirate captains, Black Mist and Whiteblade, entirely on his own. Among the 7 vice captains of the Ghost Hand pirates, the 1st Squad's deputy reigned supreme, boasting a bounty on par with 300 to 400 million berries. Next in line are the 2nd, 3rd, and 6th squads. The officers currently facing our heroes, Kaku and the rest, each carry bounties between 200 and 300 million berries, solid mid-tier commanders in any of the 4 emperors' fleets in the New World. By reputation, Black Mist carries a 200 million berry reward, and Whiteblade 220 million. Yet their earlier pursuit of Kaku had drained both their physical reserves and their ability to channel haki. Now they strained under the 3rd vice-captain's relentless offense, while Nethan and his comrades pressed the advantage elsewhere. Sweat trickled down Nethan's brow as he squared off against a new challenger. Even though his boots dug into the deck, the ship pitched wildly beneath them, each wave threatening to throw the duelers off balance. Summoning every ounce of his strength, Nethan steadied his stance, braced for the next strike. Behind him, muffled grunts and clashing steel told the rest of the story. Victory hung in the balance, and no one, not Nethan, not Kaku, nor the fierce 3rd Squad vice-captain, would yield an inch. The battle for supremacy among the Ghost Hand pirates was reaching its crescendo. And if tonight's clash proved anything, it was that these young fighters had grown far beyond what anyone expected of mere cadre. After 4 grueling hours of combat, they still hadn't managed to bring down the 3rd Division's vice-captain of the Ghost Hand Pirates. Could this truly be the pinnacle of strength for the captain of the Whitebeard Pirates? Blood dripped down the vice-captain's scarred face, his uniform in tatters, yet he stood unshaken, feral, unrelenting. Nethan, captain of the Whitebeard crew, tightened his grip on his broad-bladed sword. His muscles burned, but his eyes blazed. With a roar, he lunged forward. "Don't get cocky, Ghost Hand bastard," he snarled. Steel rang against steel, sparks flying as their blades met. In the next instant, the vice-captain seized a brief opening and kicked Nethan square in the chest, sending him crashing backward across the deck. Before his opponent could press the advantage, Baijan, Nethan's loyal first mate, swooped in, blade whistling as he intercepted the vice-captain's follow-up strike. Nethan forced himself to his feet, every breath a ragged gasp, only to see Ghost Hand pirates surging toward them from all sides. There was no time for elaborate maneuvers. With Baijan at his side, he plunged back into the fray. Around them, swords clashed in a cacophony of steel and cries. The deck slicked with blood as casualties mounted. Neither side would relent. With every savage blow struck, the 2 captains edged closer to a final decisive moment, though which one would stand victorious remained anyone's guess. 2 of the 4 remaining ships were already battered, their hulls cracked, and decks listing badly. The Ghost Hand pirates really were a force to be reckoned with. Captain Whiteblade's jaw tightened. This fight was heading for a stalemate. Neither side could claim victory, yet both would emerge bloodied. And here, in Whitebeard territory, a draw would be a disaster. News of even a minor Ghost Hand triumph would tarnish the Whitebeard pirates' hard-earned reputation. Whiteblade swung his twin blades in a furious arc, blocking a crushing blow from the 3rd Division's vice-captain when a flicker at the horizon caught his eye. He froze, then a slow smile spread across his face. "Look," he barked. "Captain Vista's ship is coming." Heiwu pivoted beside him, and like his captain, spotted the distant silhouette cutting through the waves. Relief and renewed hope washed over the Whitebeard crew as the proud banner of the 5th Division, led by Captain Foil Vista, loomed ever closer. Vista has just been promoted to captain of the 2nd Division, making him 5th in command of the Whitebeard pirates. Only Whitebeard himself and the 4 1st Division captains outrank him. "I'd hoped to best you before he even arrived, Robber, but your resistance has proved surprisingly stubborn. Unfortunately, it's over now." Captain Heiwu stood before me, sword held horizontally, contempt blazing in his eyes. "The vice-captain of the Ghost Hand pirates may be a capable fighter, but against Captain Vista, he's like a wounded dog. One well-placed strike would end him. And this is Whitebeard territory. Any Ghost Hand pirate who thought to pick a fight here was courting disaster." "Captain, this is trouble," muttered the 3rd Division's deputy captain, glancing anxiously at the Whitebeard flagship sailing in fast on the horizon. As vice-captain of the Ghost Hand pirates' support unit, he knew all too well exactly whose jaws they were about to walk into. Almost 1,600 men sail under the Whitebeard flag, organized into 16 divisions, each overseen by one of Whitebeard's 15 captains and his own subordinate officers. Beyond those divisions, 43 independent pirate crews in the New World also fly his banner, names like City, Black Mist, and White Blade among them. Any ship bearing Whitebeard's emblem is an extension of his power. So when a fresh squadron appeared on the horizon, unmistakably under the Whitebeard flag, the small fleet in battle knew instinctively that reinforcements had arrived. "Vice Captain Nethin, what are your orders?" hissed a third-rank officer at Nethin's side. Around them, the few remaining ships of their group lay crippled, torn by cannon fire. On deck, fighters from both sides tumbled into a chaotic skirmish, making any chance of escape hopeless. Nethin's eyes narrowed as the Whitebeard vessels drew ever closer. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and nowhere to run. He forced himself to breathe evenly, every muscle tensing for the orders he would have to give. Meanwhile, aboard one of Whitebeard's ships, Captain Foil Vista of the 5th Division stood at the prow, his gaze fixed on the distant skirmish. Though his expression remained composed, a low simmer of anger rippled beneath the surface. Were all the Ghost Hand raiders truly this audacious? To storm into our waters as if they owned them? One of the officers behind him slammed a fist against the deck rail. "They've crossed every line. How dare they attack in our territory?" Vista's eyes narrowed to slits. "Let today serve as a lesson. No matter how brazen they become, if they harm a single one of our comrades, they'll never forget the price. These seas are not, and will never be, the Ghost Hands." Chapter 324, Vista and the Rain's Shiryu, Part 2. The flagship bore down on the battlefield, its hull slicing through the choppy sea. Vista's eyes narrowed as he gauged the distance to the fighting ships ahead. In an instant, he sprang into motion. Leaping in a graceful arc, he cut through the air and landed on the bow of the nearest vessel. His fingers grazed the raised rail for balance before he vaulted again, over the empty gap toward the second ship. Below him, two combatants, Black Mist and White Blade, wrestled fiercely with the vice captain of Dew's 3rd Division. Dual swords clutched in hand, the vice captain was drenched in sweat and blood, his armor dented and stained. He let out a defiant roar as he swung at his opponents, desperate to vanquish them before Whitebeard's flagship could join the fray. But even with his life on the line, the difference in skill was too slight to allow a quick victory. No matter how ferocious his assault, he couldn't overwhelm both Black Mist and White Blade in the time he had. At best, he could hope to force a temporary stalemate and pray reinforcements arrived before his strength gave out. From the shadows of the crow's nest, Vista surveyed the clash, the tension coiling in his muscles. As rain-slick decks creaked beneath his boots, he readied himself for the moment he would strike. The battle was far from over, and the rain would soon bear witness to a new tide of conflict. Nethin's blade flashed in a wild arc as he fought desperately to subdue both Haiwu and Byron at once. Then, without warning, a soft shower of what looked like flower petals drifted in from the side. One brushed his cheek, and in that instant he felt the sting of cold steel and saw a crimson bloom on his skin. Those weren't petals at all, but razor-sharp blades. The 3rd Division's vice-captain froze in mid-charge, eyes wide, then somersaulted backward just in time to avoid the deadly petals sweeping past. Haiwu and Byron halted their assault and turned toward the new threat. A tall figure, cloaked in black, a top hat perched at a rakish angle, twin swords gleaming in his hands. With a single, fluid motion, the stranger thrust both swords into the deck, forcing the vice-captain back on his heels. Unshaken, he offered a calm, measured smile. "Vice Captain," he said, voice low and confident, "I'm Vista, captain of the 3rd Division of the Whitebeard Pirates." He withdrew his blade slowly and finished. "Tell me, do you recognize me?" Chapter 7. A heavy stillness settled over the training grounds as Vice Captain Nethin of the 3rd Division faced down Bista, the swordsman renowned for his twin-blade technique. Though Bista's very presence pressed down like a storm about to break, Nethin stood his ground, unyielding, unafraid. With cool detachment, he met Bista's gaze and said, "So you didn't know? When your subordinates can't fight, it falls to you, the boss, to take up arms yourself." Vista's lips curved into a polite, almost gentlemanly smile. Yet the calm of his posture belied the lethal energy coiling in his muscles. He drew his two swords from their sheaths, and then, almost casually, chose only the right-hand blade. He leveled it before him, the flat of the blade glinting in the afternoon sun. "Then where is the boss when the enemy shows up?" Vista taunted, voice low and clear. In an instant, he sprang forward. His sword cut through the air, whipping petals into a spiraling dance. Nethin's eyes sharpened. He brought both of his own swords to meet the attack, crossing their blades in front of him. With a crack like thunder, steel met steel, showering sparks into the clearing. Pain bloomed across Nethin's left shoulder as a fierce edge bit through his tunic, drawing a line of red. Yet he held firm, every sinew coiled, ready for the next exchange. That single clashing moment, sword against sword, warrior against warrior, set the stage for a duel that would decide more than mere pride. It was a test of leadership, skill, and the unwavering spirit of those sworn to protect. And neither man would back down. Nethin's twin blades gleamed in the twilight as he faced the third team's vice-captain. "You still haven't mastered true dual sword technique," he said calmly. With a sudden thrust of his swords, he drove his opponent back several paces. The difference in skill was undeniable. The vice-captain stumbled, eyes widening. Nethin didn't hesitate. He flipped both blades with effortless precision and unleashed a powerful slash from a distance. A torrent of crimson sword energy roared forward like a charging stallion. "If you want to run roughshod through our waters, you'll have to wait another 2 years," he challenged. Boom! The vice-captain tried to cross his swords in defense, but the blast caught him squarely. He flew backward, arms flailing, tumbled over the ship's rail, and disappeared into the dark sea below. Nethin sheathed his swords and stepped to the railing, peering down. Dozens of figures bobbed among the wreckage, fallen enemies, already submerged. Then a head broke the surface, coughing up salty water. The vice-captain struggled to keep afloat, gasping for breath. His uniform was drenched, face pale, but he was alive. Nethin watched impassively, awaiting the next move. Though Nethin hadn't been gravely injured, he was clearly outmatched by Vista. Just as Vista prepared to finish him off, the swordsman suddenly paused. He lifted his gaze to the distant horizon, where a colossal pirate ship, its sails emblazoned with the Ghost Hand Pirate's skull and fingers banner, cleaved through the churning sea at full tilt. On the deck, Bruno and the others caught sight of the newcomer, and the moment the flag snapped into view, Bruno's voice rang out. "It's the 2nd Division, Captain Shiryu's ship." In an instant, Vista's sagging resolve snapped back to life. He retained the courteous smile of a duelist at his lips, but his eyes glinted with renewed intensity. None of them had expected the Ghost Hand Pirates to dispatch reinforcements into what was essentially their own backyard. Was this a prelude to all-out war? Vista steadied his blade and held his ground. The Whitebeard pirates around him showed no fear, but neither could they lightly decide to open hostilities with the Ghost Hand Pirates on the open sea. The standoff hung heavy in the air as both sides waited to see who would strike first. Chapter 10: Reinforcements Arrive. The skirmish had been contained, for now, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. At last, the 2nd Squadron's flagship emerged above the fray. On the foredeck stood Shiryu of the Rain, his black cloak whipping in the wind. He surveyed the battered vessels below, lips curling into a predatory grin. With a sudden leap, he disappeared into the air, stepping across open space as though treading on moonlight. In the time it takes to blink, he landed on the deck of a pirate ship, struggling to stay afloat, just yards from where Vista hovered on another broken mast. "Captain Shiryu!" The call came from below, where the 3rd Division's vice-captain bobbed on drifting wreckage. Shiryu didn't turn immediately. He took a long drag from his cigar, then tilted his head at the hail. "Scott's in a state," he growled, eyes narrowed. "Entire crew's half dead. You think he did this to himself?" On the neighboring ship, Vista watched him coolly. "I've heard your name," he replied evenly. "Back when you were still the warden of Advancing City." Shiryu exhaled a lazy plume of smoke. "That was ages ago," he said. "Moved on long before I joined the Ghost Hand Pirates." He stepped off the pirate vessel, blade drawn, and faced Vista across the narrow gap separating their ships. Above them, storm clouds gathered, and both men knew the calm wouldn't last much longer. Shiryu of the Rain stood beneath his black cloak, smoke curling around him as he surveyed the broken landscape before him. His voice, calm and resolute, carried across the clearing. I am now the commander of the Qing Army's 2nd Division, under the banner of Wan Guo. Across from him, Vista's expression darkened. He stepped forward, eyes hard as flint. You ghost-handed, he said slowly. You've trespassed on our soil and brought nothing but trouble. Explain yourselves, or prepare for war. Shiryu tapped ash from his cigar, then met Vista's glare without flinching. Did you forget what our captain orders is absolute? He replied, his tone icy. Sensing Shiryu's aura shift, Vista's hand moved instinctively to the hilt of his sword. A thin plume of smoke drifted from Shiryu's mouth as a cold light flashed in his eyes. Very well, Shiryu breathed. Let mercy die with this land. Chapter 25, Ice vs. Flower, 3rd update. A sudden gale swept across the deck as Shiryu of the Rain drew his sword with a single, fluid motion. An afterimage shimmered in the air behind him, and in the next instant he was upon Fleet Admiral Vista. The 2nd-generation ghost sword in his hand gleamed with frigid light as he brought it down in a deadly arc. Vista met the attack without a flicker of hesitation. He crossed his twin blades in front of him, deflecting Shiryu's strike with a thunderous clang. Shards of frozen petals exploded outward, each one like a tiny crystal hanging in midair. A cold smile played at the corner of Vista's mouth. He would not allow the Whitebeard pirates to suffer dishonor under his watch. If the enemy was eager to fight, then he would give them a battle to remember. With a swift pivot of his feet, he swept both swords in a brilliant double slash. The blades whistled as they carved through the air, one arc like a petal drifting on the breeze, the other like a shard of ice. Shiryu's stance held firm, his own sword meeting each blow with unshakable resolve. Sparks flew again as steel met steel, but neither man yielded an inch. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Two masters locked in a dance of ice and steel, petals and frost swirling around them. Then Shiryu's eyes narrowed, and he shifted his weight, preparing for his next move. The storm was only beginning, and neither side intended to back down. A wave of bone-chilling cold rippled outward from Shiryu of the Rain's blade, instantly frosting half the edge of Nethan's sword. In moments, Shiryu's very cloak, jet black before, was sheathed in a rim of frost. Wherever he stepped, the wooden deck beneath him sprouted lacework patterns of ice, each footfall leaving a crystallized signature. Nethan stared, unblinking, at the frozen half of his blade. Ice-infused swordsmanship. No, this was the hallmark of a devil fruit power. He'd assumed Shiryu's mastery lay in refined, ice-style kenjutsu, not the supernatural gift of a devil fruit. During their first clash, he'd noted that Shiryu's technique was nearly on par with his own, and that he appeared fruitless. If Shiryu could fuse that elemental power with already formidable blade skills, his advantage would be decisive. Determination steeled Nethan's nerves. He drew breath and summoned his armament haki. A dusky aura flared around his twin swords, their steel turning to a deep, polished black. Under the pressure of his haki, the frost shattered away like brittle glass, clattering across the ship's deck. Nethan tightened his grip. Now, blade to blade, it was on equal footing. And this time, he would be the one to strike first. Shiryu of the Rain snorted coldly and took a decisive step forward, his blade flashing with ruthless intent. In his early days, his swordplay had leaned heavily on sheer killing power and brutality, vastly different from Admiral Fujitora's straightforward, gravity-driven blows. But ever since the Lang Lang fruit had matured within him, Shiryu had embraced a more frontal, strong style. Only those with unstoppable force could wield it properly. Each strike drags the opponent into a direct collision, each cut presses them back, driving them inch by inch toward despair. Facing Shiryu's onslaught, Vista had no choice but to parry. A pure dodge would invite a relentless follow-up, second blade, third blade, and he'd be overwhelmed. For a swordsman who casts aside all defense in favor of attack, once the opponent resorts to pure evasion, the balance of power begins to tip. Clang. Under Shiryu of the Rain's relentless assault, Nethan's footing gave way on the battered deck planks, which groaned and cracked beneath him. Seizing the moment, Shiryu pressed on, his ice-infused blade cutting through the air with unforgiving precision. Each strike left no room for Nethan to catch his breath. The fusion of Shiryu's logia power and swordsmanship was so complete that were he to face Admiral Fujitora now, the outcome would hang by the narrowest of threads. Truly, a fee. T50 gamble between victory and defeat. Captain Nethan. At the ship's rail, Heiwu and Bai Ren exchanged astonished glances. In all their years with the Whitebeard pirates, they had never seen anyone push the famed foil of the seas so close to the edge. Rumor held that Nethan longed to challenge Dracule Mihawk, the peerless Hawkeye, but Mihawk's unpredictable voyages made arranging a duel impossible. And as the pirate crew's captain, Nethan could not simply abandon his men in pursuit of a legend. Yet now, forced onto the defensive, he seemed anything but invincible, and for the first time, his officers wondered if Hawkeye still deserved the title of the world's greatest swordsman. Shiryu's eyes were as cold and clear as the blade in his hand, each movement measured and merciless. Sweat and sea spray stung Nethan's eyes, but he forced himself to steady his breathing. Muscles coiled and released as he met one cut after another, barely parrying each blow. Pain radiated up his arms, but in his chest a stubborn spark still burned. He would not yield. With a deafening clash, their swords locked, ice-encrusted steel against tempered brilliance. Splinters flew, and the deck trembled as though it might collapse under the fury of their duel. Above them, storm clouds rumbled and lightning flickered across the sky. Yet in that moment of suspended chaos, nothing existed but the two swordsmen and the searing will to triumph. Before Shiryu of the Rain, Nethan found himself utterly outmatched, unbelievable. The famed Captain Nethan was suddenly at a disadvantage. Shiryu of the Rain, the dreaded slayer of the Ghost Hand pirates, had managed to seize the upper hand. A hush fell over the crowd as everyone watched Nethan struggle under Shiryu's relentless assault. Behind him, the members of the 3rd Division exchanged triumphant grins, while Whitebeard's pirates felt their hearts sink. Splash! The 3rd Division's lieutenant hauled himself out of the water and strode up to Heiwu and Baijin, water dripping from his blade. He let out a triumphant laugh. "Looks like your captain can't handle ours," he sneered. Heiwu and Baijin scowled in reply. The lieutenant shook the last of the water from his sword, his eyes flicking to the swirling black mist around Shiryu and Nethan's gleaming white blade. "Where did all that confidence go?" he mocked. "I never expected Nethan to spring that move on us and almost turn the tide in his favor." Shiryu of the Rain arrived just in time, his expression dark with displeasure. With reinforcements on the way, there was no longer any question. He raised his blade and snarled, "Finish them!" In a blur of motion, the vice-captain of the 2nd Division rallied his officers and swept every soldier they could spare into the fray. At the same moment, Whitebeard's pirates, ferried in on Vista's ship, stormed the battlefield from the opposite flank. What had been a lull after 4 hours of brutal combat erupted into a full-scale clash. With a thunderous crack, Shiryu and Vista brought down the shattered remains of the boat, plunging into the churning sea. Vista threw himself onto a floating plank, struggling for balance, while Shiryu plunged his sword deep into the water. "Frost source," he shouted. A surge of bone-chilling cold raced down the blade's length, seeping into the surrounding ocean. In an instant, the waters froze solid, spreading out in every direction until a full kilometer of the sea surface had transformed into a gleaming island of ice. Vista narrowed his eyes as he stood atop the makeshift raft, surveying their new battlefield. A solid sheet of ice now lay before them, a perfect, unyielding foothold on which to wage the next phase of their war. Nethan smashed the wooden board beneath his feet and lunged at Shiryu of the Rain, determined to seize the initiative and shift from defense to offense. "Twin blade ascent!" he roared, driving both swords upward in a deadly V-shape. The black steel glinted with ruthless intent, one blade rising from the left, the other from the right. Shiryu at the onslaught head-on, his horizontal sword locking against Nethan's twin blades. Clang! Sparks erupted as the two weapons ground together like a whetstone against steel. Without pause, Nethan flowed into the next move. "Twin blade overwhelm," he barked, pressing the attack, first ripping his swords upward, then driving them down in a crushing pincer. His strikes came in rapid succession, each one more fierce than the last. Even under such a storm of steel, Shiryu's face remained placid, a smoldering cigar clamped between his teeth. He retreated a single, measured step and began to spin his blade, the legendary second-generation ghost, in a graceful up-and-down arc. Ding-ding-dong. Each metallic ring heralded Shiryu's calm, calculated riposte to Nethin's furious assault. Nethin's blade struck like lightning, dozens of blows in the blink of an eye, forcing Shiryu of the Rain to stumble back 4 paces. Yet no wound marred Shiryu's armor. Every strike was met by an impossibly swift parry. Shiryu cracked a wry smile. As Nithin lunged for a decisive thrust, Shiryu met it blade to blade, then flicked his wrist. Nithin skidded backward across the frozen ground. Peering down at him, Shiryu said coldly, "Now it's my turn." He could feel the ice fruit's power surging through his veins. The energy he'd spent sealing that kilometer-wide frozen expanse had nearly replenished. 200 HP. A frigid gleam lit Shiryu's eyes. In the next instant, he blurred forward like a living shadow, frost trailing behind him as moisture in the air crystallized on the spot. Dual frost slash. Shiryu's blade, wreathed in biting cold, descended in a deadly, arcing strike. Nethin barely had time to brace himself as the extreme chill ripped through the air toward him. Chapter 326, Phoenix Marco, Part 1. Vista met Shiryu of the Rain's twin-knife horizontal slash head-on. He reinforced his blade and armor with the full force of his armament haki, bracing himself against the sudden blast of icy energy. When steel met steel, a cascade of sparkling ice crystals burst into the air, not shards flaking off the blades, but moisture frozen instantaneously by the stray frost power seeping from Shiryu's attack. Undeterred, Shiryu advanced with ruthless precision. Each swing of his sword carved frosty trails through the air, as if droplets of water were being hurled at high speed into a zero wind and instantly solidified into glimmering ice particles. The frozen mist drifted like phantoms in their wake, lingering long enough to remind everyone present of the raw chill behind Shiryu's technique. The Whitebeard pirates watched in stunned silence. Vista, their formidable captain, was being driven backward step by step. A few tried to rush in and offer support, but none could get close enough to even draw a bead on Shiryu's swirling, frost-laced blade. Shiryu of the Rain stood motionless on the frozen plain, a smoldering cigar clenched between his teeth. Icy wind whipped at his coat, but his gaze never wavered. With a sudden, fluid motion, his blade, wrapped in swirling frost, descended on Vista's crossed twin swords. Metal rang on metal in a shower of sparks and crystalline ice flowers. The cold surge that followed shoved Vista's blades aside and slowed his counterattack almost instantly. Seizing the moment, Shiryu swung his leg in a devastating kick. The blade of his boot struck Vista square in the chest. With a thunderous crack, Vista was sent hurtling backward. Frost bloomed like shattered glass across his coat as he careened toward the ice. Shiryu spat out a wisp of smoke, watching impassively as the famed captain of the Whitebeard pirates tumbled through the air. "So this is your best?" he murmured. Though the blow hadn't ended the fight, it had crippled Vista's defenses. In less than half an hour, Shiryu was confident the outcome would be decided in his favor. But before Vista could hit the ice, a shadow flickered at his side. In the blink of an eye, a lone figure darted forward and slid beneath Vista's outstretched arms, catching him just inches above the frozen ground. The newcomer's cloak billowed as he brought Vista to his feet, all without uttering a sound. Shiryu's cold eyes narrowed. "Who?" The figure lowered his hood, revealing dark hair and sharp, determined features. He met Shiryu's stare without hesitation. "My name," he said quietly, "is Nethin." Nethin planted himself between Shiryu and the staggering Vista. Ice cracked under his boots as he readied his stance. Shiryu lunged again, blade first, but Nethin was already moving. With a deft sidestep and a swift parry, he caught Shiryu's frost-laden sword on his forearm, sparks and frost bursting outward. Shiryu snarled, shifting his weight for another strike. Nethin didn't flinch. He dropped low, sweeping his leg in a precise arc that clipped Shiryu's ankle. The larger man stumbled. Seizing the advantage, Nethin spun behind him, blade flashing in a graceful arc. The tip of his sword found the seam in Shiryu's coat, nicking the hide and sending a fine spray of frost into the air. Their weapons locked for an instant, two deadly wills bound in ice and steel, before Shiryu snarled and yanked his blade free. He backed away, chest heaving, frost creeping along his collar. Nethin stood firm, every muscle taut, eyes blazing. Shiryu flicked ash from his cigar. Impressive, he admitted in a low voice. But I am not finished. Nethan met his gaze steadily. Then let's finish this properly. Above them, the sky crackled with cold energy, and the frozen plain held its breath. Two warriors faced off once more. Shiryu of the Rain, master of Frost and Fury, and Nethan, the enigmatic swordsman who had just arrived to tip the scales. And as Vista struggled to his feet behind Nethan, the battle for supremacy on this icebound Eld was just beginning. A strange blue flame flickered to life, washing over Vista's frost-rimed chest. In an instant, the icy scars vanished, the frostbite burned away by the miraculous heat. Nethan narrowed his eyes at the newcomer. He'd never seen that flame in person, but it matched the descriptions he'd uncovered in his research on the Whitebeard pirates. Phoenix Marco, captain of the 1st Division. Another captain? That just made things far more complicated. From a distance, Bruno and the rest of the Whitebeard crew witnessed the scene. Their faces tightened. It would have been one thing if a low-ranking captain had appeared, but Marco outranked even Vista himself. He was second only to Whitebeard. Despite their surprise at seeing Nethan's rainfall technique overpower Vista, none of them panicked. They knew they hadn't come alone. Nethan let out a relieved breath and offered a nod toward Marco. Thanks, Marco. Vista shook himself free of the last lingering chills. Under Phoenix Marco's regenerating flames, his frostbite had all but healed. He drew himself up, ready to continue the fight, now with two of Whitebeard's finest standing by his side. Nethan stood firm, cobalt blue flames licking his arms as he turned to face Shiryu of the Rain. His voice was low, icy. The Ghost Hand pirates really are a reckless lot. Shiryu of the Rain let out a derisive snort, crimson sparks flickering in his eyes. Nethan's gaze sharpened. Everything you stole from us will be returned. Then you'll leave our waters for good. Shiryu's lips curved into a cold smile. And if I refuse? Then we go to war, Nethan said, his tone deadly calm. This isn't some petty squabble we can settle over drinks. It's inevitable now. Draw blades against us, and you'll regret ever stepping aboard. A soft, mocking laugh escaped Shiryu. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, as if savoring the moment, and when he opened them again, their red sheen was all the answer Nethan needed. By all means, Shiryu challenged, give it your best shot. Nethan felt a surge of fury at Shiryu's insolence, especially in front of Vista, who stood resolute at his side. The Ghost Hand pirates had made their choice. There was no turning back. The clash to come would determine whose claim on these seas was ironclad, and whose would be sunk forever. On these seas, the Whitebeard pirates fear no one. With a thunderous crash, battle erupted in an instant. Blue flames flickered across the deck as Shiryu of the Rain's chilling blade sliced the frozen surface, sending countless ice fragments flying. As captain of Whitebeard's 1st Division, Marco's strength was legendary. His mythical zone, the Phoenix Fruit, granted him an immortal body. Unless his stamina ran dry or his powers were forcibly nullified, every wound he suffered simply healed itself. Clang! Shiryu pressed the attack, weaving through a dozen furious strikes in the space of a heartbeat. But as the fight raged on, he realized the true gravity of Marco's advantage. A swordsman lives by overwhelming offense, leaving defenses thin, yet Marco shrugged off every slash. With each exchanged blow, the Phoenix's regenerative might chipped away at Shiryu's far more fragile body. Faced with an enemy who could ignore his best assaults and retaliate in kind, the Rain swordsman found himself at a painful disadvantage. Nethan of the Rain's jaw tightened. Against Katakuri, he might have stood a fair fight, maybe even tipped the odds slightly in his favor. But facing Marco was an entirely different matter. Marco's devilish abilities, combined with Foil Vista's support, made this no mere duel. This was open warfare, and the objective was clear: annihilate the enemy. With a sudden roar, Vista lunged. His gleaming blade swept toward Nethan's guard. Steel rang on steel as Nethan met the attack, but before he could regain his balance, Marco's boot slammed into his ribs. Nethan's world seemed to tilt as he was hurled across the deck. The impact cracked the frozen planks beneath him and sent shards of ice spraying into the air. A jagged fracture split the hull. At once, a churn of frigid air burst forth from the ship's belly, coating the lower decks in a creeping frost. Nethan coughed, the cold burning his lungs, but he refused to yield. He pushed himself up, snow-dusted hair plastered against his forehead. Between the swirling ice and the clamor of battle, he spotted Marco's smirk and Vista's poised stance. So this was what it took to break him. A fierce determination flared in Nathan's eyes. Gathering every ounce of his strength, he braced himself for the next strike. In this war, there would be no mercy, and he vowed he would give none in return. Nathan found himself alone against two of the Guardians. An uneven fight he felt in his bones was foolish to engage. Still, he drew a steady breath and refused to back down. A crackle of cold air heralded the arrival of the first opponent, Shiryu of the Rain. Frost clung to his once silver armor, icicles dangling from his pauldrons like jagged tears. He emerged slowly from a jagged fissure in the earth, each step sending puffs of mist curling into the air. Beside the frosted guardian stood Foil Vista, unwavering and composed. His dark eyes regarded Nathan without a flicker of doubt. In a calm, measured voice, he declared, "You have committed a grave mistake by waging war on our territory. Now steel yourself for the end." Nathan's heart pounded, but he straightened his shoulders. Outnumbered though he was, he would not let fear claim him. The two guardians readied their weapons, and the final reckoning began. Chapter 327, 3 against 2. I've already told you, this is our territory. We won't let the ghost hand pirates run amok here. Marco's eyes narrowed, a twisted grin curving his lips. With a fierce cry, he lunged at Shiryu of the Rain. Beside him, Vista shifted forward, ready to join the assault. Shiryu suddenly found himself facing two seasoned captains alone, and with one of them nullifying his ranged advantage, he quickly slipped into a desperate defensive stance. Blades clashed in rapid succession as he parried Marco's and Vista's combined onslaught. But amid the whirlwind of steel, Shiryu's guard faltered. Marco seized the opening, driving a brutal kick into Shiryu's shoulder and sending him cartwheeling through the air. As Shiryu crashed toward the ground, Marco's knife descended in a deadly arc. Hua! In a last-ditch move, Shiryu slammed both hands onto his sword's hilt and plunged its blade into the earth. He poured every ounce of his cold fruit power into the strike. Frost spread in an instant, coating the battlefield in a shimmering blanket of ice that radiated outward in all directions. Immediately afterward, a bone-chilling wind howled across the frozen ground. Vista's boots cracked beneath the ice, and Marco's confident grin faded as he struggled to maintain his footing. Seizing the moment, Shiryu yanked his sword free, the frost snapping away with a hiss. He sprang to his feet, ready to press his advantage once more, and the duel raged on under the wintry glare of magic and steel. Shiryu of the Rain spun to his feet, each movement radiating a biting chill that painted icy after-images across the void. When his blade arced through the air, it gleamed like moonlight on still water. For a moment, his full-powered assault staggered Marco and Vista, but facing two opponents whose combined strength equaled his own, Shiryu's advantage was fleeting. Gradually, he began to lose ground. Vista laughed and drove her sword forward. A streak of crimson-sparked energy slashed across Shiryu's left shoulder. At the same instant, Marco transformed into a blazing blue phoenix's claw, raking a fierce gouge into his back. Under their coordinated onslaught, Shiryu's defenses faltered. One by one, minor wounds accumulated, each threatening to tip the battle irrevocably against him. Worse still, Marco's unique resilience thwarted any hope of Shiryu striking Vista first. No matter how fiercely he attacked, Marco could always interpose his body to absorb the blow. Bleeding and staggered, Shiryu, captain of the Flurry division, gritted his teeth. Frost glinted in his eyes as he prepared to press on, knowing that hesitation would only cost him more than wounds. The second and third divisions watched from the sidelines in growing anxiety. There was simply nothing they could do. Even if they'd managed to free a hand, no one could break through the clash between Shiryu of the Rain and Marco. On the other side, Whitebeard's pirates were surging forward with brutal momentum. Ganging up on two foes at once may have been dishonorable by some codes of conduct, but in war, there is no chivalry, only victory or defeat. Kill them! They dared to invade our waters. Let them feel our wrath, they roared in unison, weapons raised high. Vista, twin blades flashing, led the charge. He unleashed a rapid storm of slashes at Shiryu of the Rain, each stroke forcing Shiryu backward. Then, with a roar that shook the deck, Vista raised both swords overhead and brought them down in a single earth-shattering arc. The force of his blow scattered crimson petals into the air. Shiryu barely managed to block the strike, his blade jolting backward as the swords tore at his guard, leaving a gaping wound across his chest. In that instant, Marco seized the opportunity. With a thunderous impact, he drove his fist into the breach. Boom! The ship rocked with the force of their collision, and the onlookers braced themselves, realizing that the tide of battle had just taken a savage turn. Marco's kick crumpled Shiryu of the Rain's body like a drawn bow, hurling him hundreds of meters through the air. He smashed into the ground with a thunderous crash and spat blood from the corner of his mouth. An admiral blessed with a natural devil fruit, like Sengoku's Hito Hito no Mi, model Daibutsu, might shrug off a blow like that, but for a master swordsman such as Shiryu, the impact was no simple bruise. One strike might not fell him outright, but a few more, and he'd be broken beyond repair. "Still standing?" Marco called, stepping forward to survey the wounded captain's battered form. "You haven't given up?" Shiryu pushed himself to his feet, face pale but eyes blazing. Marco exchanged a look with Vista. Even 2-on-1, they would struggle to hold Shiryu if he truly meant to flee. Yet the swordsman showed no sign of retreat. "If you wait until you're this badly hurt to fall back," Marco warned, voice low, "it'll be too late. Neither Vista nor I could stop you at full strength, but a crippled Shiryu of the Rain isn't fit to lead. 1 against 2, you don't stand a chance." Marco's words died on his lips as Shiryu of the Rain let go of his sword hilt. He dragged the blade across the corner of his mouth, wiping away the blood before flicking it clear. His head dipped, and then a cold, terrifying smile curled at his lips. "1 man against 2, he mused. "That's unfair, unless it isn't 1 against 2 at all." At Shiryu's words, Marco's brow tightened. A shiver ran down his spine as he turned toward the horizon. Across the frozen expanse, 1,000 meters of wind-whipped ice, 2 massive pirate ships burst through the snowdrifts, their tattered sails flying the Ghost Hand Pirates' terrifying emblem. "Reinforcements?" Marco gasped, his face paling. Beside him, Vista's jaw clenched. "This isn't good, but Dad and the others should be closing in, any second now." The nearest ship ground to a halt a mere 100 meters away. A figure on its deck crackled with electricity. In a heartbeat, he vanished, only to reappear amid them on the battlefield. He was draped in a black cloak, arcs of lightning dancing over his form. "Thunder Giant! Helding!" Halding let out a wry laugh. "You really think you're invincible, Captain Shiryu?" Shiryu of the Rain, his body etched with countless scars, snorted. "I'm still breathing, aren't I? Doesn't mean I can't handle what's coming." He spat on the ground. "That troublemaker's on his way." Marco's eyes flicked to Halding, who had materialized beside them in the blink of an eye. He forced a neutral expression, but inside he was anything but calm. The name Thunder Giant was notorious throughout the Grand Line, and the lightning-fast speed Halding had just displayed left no doubt. They were about to face a lethal adversary. A distant creak, creak, creak cut through the tension. The rhythmic thud of wooden sandals on ice followed. All eyes turned toward the slow, deliberate approach of a lone figure cloaked in black. In one hand he carried a simple wooden staff, in the other an aura of quiet menace. He moved without haste, but each step resonated like a drumbeat against their chests. Vista's face paled. This was Admiral Fujitora, the 1st Division's captain of the Ghost Hand Pirates, and his bounty soared a staggering 1 billion berries. He may not rival Shiryu of the Rain's own price tag, but the 1st Division outranked the 2nd, and Fujitora had only joined their ranks relatively recently. Even newcomers could climb the hierarchy quickly, and Fujitora's reputation made him especially dangerous. As the cloaked figure drew nearer, the wind died down, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The threat standing before them wasn't merely another pirate captain, it was a force of nature waiting to strike. And now, there was nowhere left to run. "Before? What does that mean?" Marco muttered, brow furrowed. "This is even trickier than Shiryu of the Rain. A moment ago, we had a clear 2-on-1 edge, and now, just like that, it's 3 against 2. We're the ones in a tight spot." A calm voice cut through the tension. Fujitora stepped forward, his blind white eye fixed on Marco and Vista, his cane held lightly at his side. "Captain of the 1st Division of Wanguo," he began quietly, "I had hoped our first meeting would be more cordial. Perhaps even a friendly smile next time." He paused, then continued in the same low tone. I've already grasped the situation. Although that devil fruit was discovered within your waters, under the world government's rules, a found devil fruit belongs to the finder. I'm here to claim what is rightfully ours. Please step aside and release it. Marco's expression turned icier. And if we refuse? Fujitora set down his cane with deliberate calm, then gripped its hidden blade and drew it free in one smooth motion. His voice remained steady. Then I'm afraid we'll have to use force to make you comply. Chapter 328. Whitebeard appears. Shiryu of the Rain and Helding fell silent as Admiral Fujitora spoke. With Nethan away, Fujitora had stepped into the role of acting second in command of the Ghost Hand Pirates. He couldn't make every major decision on his own, but he outranked both Shiryu and Helding. A tense hush fell over the deck. Then, with a soft hum, Fujitora brought his Kanabo staff down in a single, fluid motion. Instantly, the power of the gravity fruit surged through the weapon. The air above the ship distorted and rippled, drawing their eyes upward. A moment later, a blinding flash tore through the sky, and the heavens themselves seemed to fracture as jagged meteors rained down. Meteorites? Marco and Vista stared upward in astonishment. This was the first time they had witnessed Fujitora's full strength. Until now, they had only suspected he was formidable. Now, it was clear he was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Vista, fall back! Marco inhaled deeply and barked the order. Facing two of the world's greatest witch hunters and a gravity-wielding admiral, there was no room for a head-on clash. The odds were grim. Understood. Vista nodded and sprang backward, wings unfolding in a blur. Whoosh! Whoosh! Fujitora's gaze never wavered as the meteors plummeted toward the retreating pair, each impact promising to reshape the battlefield. The battle, and the legend of Whitebeard's arrival, had only just begun. Marco and Vista lunged back, putting several dozen meters between themselves and Fujitora. His imperious gaze tracked their every move. With a slight tilt of his head, he swung the blade-tipped staff in his hand, directing its power toward the sky. Under his command, the falling meteorite shifted course, hurtling straight for them with renewed force. Seeing no way to dodge the impact, Marco cried out and was instantly wreathed in blue flames. In a brilliant flash, he transformed into his phoenix form and dove headlong toward the oncoming rock. At the same moment, Vista leapt forward, brandishing both swords. With a sweeping arc, he cleaved the meteorite cleanly in half, and then in half again, reducing it to 4 massive fragments. Boom! The 2 largest pieces shattered beneath Marco's fiery wings, while the remaining shards crashed onto the island's frozen surface. The collision sent cracks spidering out in every direction, splintering nearly a square kilometer of ice into jagged fragments. The shockwave rippled across the battlefield, forcing every combatant to dig their heels in just to stay upright, lest they slip on the broken ice and plunge into the freezing waters below. Shiryu of the Rain stood atop the tilted ice floe, surveying the shattered chunks of frozen sea. Without a flicker of emotion, he glanced at Admiral Fujitora and drove his sword into the water. A hum resonated through the air as his ice fruit power activated, binding the fractured ice back into a single, solid mass. Oops, sorry, I forgot this isn't an island anymore, Fujitora mumbled, rubbing the back of his head in embarrassed apology. But Shiryu's impassive stare told him that words alone wouldn't cut it. No wonder the Admiral had been so careless. While Shiryu chided Fujitora, Halding streaked through the air like a bolt of lightning. He swept his arm upward, channeling a crackling surge of energy. 100 million volts! Lightning strike! He roared. Brilliant forks of thunder tore through the sky, hurtling straight for Marco and Vista. Marco and Vista, who had just barely parried Fujitora's earlier assault, exchanged tense glances. They steeled themselves and raised their arms in unison, bracing to deflect Halding's onslaught. But before they could react further, Shiryu of the Rain abandoned his scolding of Fujitora. He leapt forward, sword in hand, eyes fixed on Marco and Vista. After being bullied by them moments ago, he was more than ready to even the score. With a sharp cry, he charged, and steel rang against steel. Shiryu of the Rain unleashed a thunder-laced slash at Vista. Caught off guard, Vista barely brought up his sword in time, but the crackling energy and the sheer force of Shiryu's blow were too much to fend off entirely. He staggered backward, a chill like ice water seeping along his arm, his teeth chattering as the sword trembled in his grip. Shireu's face remained impassive as he pressed the attack without hesitation. Helding and Fujitora joined in, their strikes relentless, and soon Nethan and Vista were on the back foot, retreating under the storm of blows. In a matter of seconds, Nithan was consumed in a roaring plume of phoenix fire, and Vista was hurled backward, jagged marks of lightning scorched across his cheek. Had Nithan not taken a share of the assault, Vista's injuries would have been far worse. Yet even a phoenix's gift has its limits. Though Nithan's regenerative flames flared bright, each resurgence drained his strength. When his endurance finally gave out, there would be no second chance. The power to command animal-type phantom beasts is almost mythical, rarer even than the nature types. Admiral Fujitora, sensing how gravely Nithan was injured, narrowed his eyes in concern. Beside him, Shiryu of the Rain and Captain Helding readied their weapons, each poised to strike again. Nithan said nothing. His face was ashen, every muscle trembling from exhaustion. He knew his gift of regeneration let him shrug off wounds others could not, but it was not limitless. He could protect Vista for now, but if his strength gave out, they would both be cut down in an instant. Enough! Fujitora's low voice carried over the field, but the battle had already resumed. Wish! Wish! Shiryu conjured razor-sharp droplets that sliced through the air. Helding's twin blades sang as they cleaved toward their targets. Nithan and Vista met the assault head-on, trading devastating blows, but three masters of combat proved overwhelming. In the aftermath of the fray, Nithan and Vista were sent flying. They crashed through the brittle ice crust, shattering it into jagged fragments that sprayed across the frozen plain. Vista landed hard on one knee, crimson staining his lips. Nithan's hand flew to his side, where a cracked rib bit into his lungs with every shallow breath. Even Nethan's immortal blood could not absorb the full fury unleashed by Fujitora, Shiryu, and Helding. The trio closed in, weapons poised to deliver the coup de grace. Shiryu of the Rain strode to the edge of the fissure, his rain cloud swirling above as he prepared to unleash another storm of blades. Helding leaned forward, blade ready to strike, and Fujitora's gravity-bent sword hovered at his side. Just as Shiryu raised his arm to summon another onslaught, a silent blur streaked across the battlefield. In the space of a heartbeat, a new figure vaulted over the shattered ice, landing between the two allies and their would-be executioners. The frozen air crackled with tension as the stranger drew near, and for a fleeting moment, even Fujitora paused, his frown deepening in surprise. Rain Shiryu's keen instincts flared as he sensed the slightest shift in his opponent's stance. In one smooth motion, he slashed out with a horizontal sword strike and met his adversary's blow head-on. The newcomer didn't stagger. Instead, he somersaulted through the air like a feather and landed lightly on the ice. "If you want to hurt me, you'll have to get through me first," he called out, flashing a confident grin. An orange pompadour crowned his head, and a scar etched along the left side of his eye. Every line of his posture spoke of strength and unshakable resolve. "I'm Sarge, captain of the 4th Division of the Whitebeard Pirates." At that name, Admiral Fujitora's senses sharpened. He let his chin drop, eyes narrowing beneath his blindfold, and tightened his grip on his sword staff. Gathering gravitational power along the blade's edge, he unleashed it in a single devastating sweep. In an instant, the air before him warped and trembled as if reality itself were bending. There was no visible arc of light, only an invisible surge of force that hurtled to war, Sarge with unstoppable momentum. Just then, a lone figure tore through the air, defying Fujitora's gravity with a bellowing roar. The ice beneath his boots fractured and splintered with each stride. In one smooth motion, he seized Fujitora's crystalline gravity blade, its surface gleaming like a cut diamond, and ripped it from the Admiral's grasp. "Captain Jaws!" the Whitebeard pirates roared in triumph. With both Captain Sage and Captain Jaws now on deck, the tide had clearly turned in their favor. Eyes trained on the horizon, they saw several vessels flying, Whitebeard's skull flag drawing near, and at their head loomed the mighty Moby Dick herself. On the shattered ice, Marco burst free of his frozen prison and collapsed beside Seijo's. Panting, he exclaimed, "I never expected backup so fast. Thank goodness you arrived when you did." Almost at once, a flash of steel illuminated the deck. Vista sprang from a cracking slab of ice. blades in hand. The four captains locked gazes with Admiral Fujitora and Shiryu of the Rain, neither side daring to make the next move. Then all eyes shifted to the stern of the Moby Dick, where a solitary figure emerged, slowly advancing across the deck with a naginata held at the ready. Nethan stepped onto the prow of the deck and came to a halt. He showed no signs of aggression and wore no fierce expression, yet his very presence was calm, commanding, and utterly breathtaking. Rumor had called him the strongest man in the world, Whitebeard, Edward Newgate. Chapter 329, Nethan versus Whitebeard. A hush fell across the Moby Dick's deck the moment Whitebeard emerged. Neither Fujitora nor Shiryu of the Rain nor any of the other Marines could pinpoint why. They weren't cowed by an overbearing glare or dazzled by a theatrical flourish. It was simply the overwhelming presence of the world's strongest pirate, a man whose name had thundered through the seas for decades. Father, Father is here. A ripple of reverent murmurs swept through the ranks of the Whitebeard pirates. Some knelt, others could only stare, their faces alight with awe. Whitebeard himself remained impassive, his great frame silhouetted against the sky as his gaze swept over the battlefield, noting every fallen comrade. His eyes settled finally on the Marines, on Fujitora, on Shiryu, and on the others who had dared to strike his family. His voice, when it came, was deceptively calm. "So this is how you treat my children? Devil fruits and the like are trifles, but you lay hands on my crew, and you expect me to let it pass?" He raised his great head, fixing his gaze on the heavens. The air crackled with anticipation. "Ghost Hand!" In that instant, the deck trembled as the sea itself seemed to recoil from the power he commanded. A vast black shape drifted down from the sky, a pirate ship, its tattered sails snapping in the icy wind. With a bone-rattling crunch, the hull ground to a halt atop the frozen plain. At the prow stood a lone figure, his cloak as dark as the winter night, eyes cold and unreadable. Four emperors, Ghost Hand Nethan. Across the ice, the great Whitebeard's booming voice carried over the hush of the deck. "One of your men has wounded my subordinates. I demand an explanation." Nethan's cloak billowed as he turned to face the legendary pirate. His tone was calm, almost detached. "Then I expect your side to explain first." Silence fell. Then Whitebeard let out a deep, rolling laugh, proud and unrestrained. "Ha! I haven't seen such arrogance in years." With that, he raised his naginata, an aura of raw power surging off him like heat from a forge. Even the hardened crew aboard trembled at the display. But Nethan did not flinch, his jaw set, eyes unwavering. Whitebeard's laughter faded, replaced by a lethal gleam. "You want answers?" he growled, advancing a step. "Perhaps it's you who should explain exactly why you dare trespass on my ice." Tension crackled between them, icy wind whipping past two of the most feared pirates on the seas, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Nethan's face didn't flicker. In a quiet, measured voice, he said, "My men located the devil fruit. It's rightfully ours. As for the wounds your crew suffered, I'll compensate you with your own territory. Fishman Island seems fitting." At once, Marco and Vista bristled, knuckles whitening on their swords' hilts. The rest of Whitebeard's men tensed, eager to spring into action, if only their captain hadn't given them that single, icy glare. Whitebeard's booming laughter rolled across the deck, but it carried no warmth, more like the roar of a volcano held back by a thin crust of ice. He let the chuckle die away, folding his great arms across his chest as he regarded Nethan. When he spoke again, his voice was a cold blade. "Are you lying in bed and dreaming this up?" Whitebeard's lips curled in contempt. "You want Fishman Island? Very well, ghost boy. If you think you can take it, come and try." In the instant the warning cut through the air, Whitebeard's left fist snapped forward. A brilliant halo of white energy spiraled around it as he drove the punch straight at Nethan. Boom! His blow tore through the void, splintering the atmosphere like a cracked mirror and unleashing a thunderous shockwave. The ice beneath them fractured in a spiderweb of fissures, and the invisible force slammed down like the unyielding weight of the heavens. "Nice little parlor trick," Nethan called out, his voice steady. He balled his right hand into a fist and thrust it into the oncoming wave. The air around his punch warped and twisted in grotesque arcs, as though reality itself were contorting. When his fist connected, the space before him buckled and collapsed in a rolling distortion. Boom! Whitebeard's shockwave and Nethin's distortion attack met in midair, exploding in a blinding flash. Ice shards and gusts of wind hissed outward, rattling the entire battlefield. "Watch out!" Marco shouted. He and the other crewmates stood just outside the main blast zone, yet they still felt the aftershocks vibrate through the ground. Even as the echoes of that collision faded, both warriors held their ground, each ready to unleash the next devastating blow. The frozen field trembled under the promise of an even greater clash to come. Everyone gasped as the shockwave from their clash rolled over the field. Instantly, the onlookers retreated to a safe distance. Between Nethin and Whitebeard, space itself seemed to twist and fold like kneaded dough, then exploded outward with devastating force. In seconds, the ice shattered in a perfect 1-kilometer radius, cracks racing across the frozen expanse like spiderwebs. Several pirates caught too close by the blast were hurled backward, swallowed in the storm of flying ice, unable even to cry out. The tremor rocked the entire island of Iceland. Fissures skittered through the ice sheet, and the surrounding sea heaved as though ready to break free. Admiral Fujitora and the other Marines' faces went pale as they fought to keep their footing against the raging aftershock. Only by sheer will did they stabilize themselves amid the chaos. Shiryu of the Rain's eyes narrowed. He planted his blade deep into the fractured ice and summoned his devil fruit power. A wave of biting cold radiated outward, refreezing and thickening the ice where it had crumbled, rebuilding their battlefield in real time. Then came the thunderous roar once more. Boom! After an indeterminate stretch of time, the roar of their clash finally died away. In the no-man's land between Nethin and Whitebeard, the ice, continually reformed by Shiryu of the Rain, lay fractured like a giant spiderweb. All around, scattered pirates were blown back hundreds of meters by the shockwave. Whitebeard slowly retracted his left arm and fixed Nethin with a steely gaze. At the same moment, Nethin drew back his right fist, his face calm. He dared a mocking grin. "You're past your prime, old man," Nethin taunted. "Even if you can still lift a blade, you're nothing but a milk-drinking kid to me. You don't stand a chance." A grin split Whitebeard's weathered face. With a mighty bellow, "Gah!" He planted both hands on the haft of his naginata. In one fluid motion, he swung it horizontally toward Nethin. The sheer length and weight of the weapon amplified the strike, cutting a broader, deadlier arc through the air. If his last blow had been mere warm-up, this was Whitebeard unleashing his true strength. The naginata tore through the frozen fragments beneath their feet, each heartbeat echoing the promise of devastation in its wake. "Could you please provide the full text of the chapter you'd like me to rewrite? Once I have the original machine-translated passage, I'll craft a clear, natural English version with Nethin as your male protagonist." Chapter 330, Whitebeard's Might. A single slash from Whitebeard's blade ripped through the air with such force it felt as though a mountain had shattered mid-collapse. Every onlooker felt their breath catch. The sheer power was absolutely unstoppable. It was the 18th year of the Great Pirate Era, and 4 years remained before the world would witness its great summit war. At 68, Whitebeard was well past the age of most men, but even beyond his prime, his strength was so overwhelming that the very seas trembled at his name. Boom! Confronted with that devastating strike, Nethin calmly drew his sword. A twisted aura of energy crackled around the blade as he swung it through empty space, rending the void in two. The crushing shockwave split along the tier, streaming harmlessly past him on either side. "Let's see how much you've still got, Whitebeard," Nethin murmured, eyes steady. With that, he surged forward in an instant, crossing the cleft in space to materialize right before the legendary pirate. Clutched in both hands was Murama, his blood-red demon sword. Nethin didn't hesitate. He lifted the sword high and slammed it down in a single thunderous strike, testing the full measure of Whitebeard's indomitable power. Clang! Whitebeard swept his colossal naginata in a horizontal arc. Nethin met the blow with his demon sword, Murasame, and though the blade was slender by comparison, it felt as if it bore the weight of an ancient mountain. The very air around them quaked under the force of their impact. They stood aboard the Moby Dick, frozen fast in the northern seas off Iceland. At Nethin's strike, the ship groaned and plunged nearly 10 meters into the cracking ice. Fissures spidered outward in every direction, and the resulting shockwave slammed into Whitebeard's officers and the lower-ranking captains, sending them stumbling backward. Even those watching from a distance felt their hearts pound at the sheer ferocity of the clash. Boom! A final, earth-shattering roar rent the air as Nethin was hurled 10 meters back, tumbling across the deck before coming to a stop. He pushed himself to his feet, wiping blood from his lip. Stronger than I expected, he thought, his eyes narrowing. After 3 brutal exchanges, he finally had a rough measure of Whitebeard's formidable strength. Roughly 2 years before Ace ever joined Whitebeard's crew, an event that would occur about 20 years ago during the peak of the Great Pirate Era, Whitebeard's power was already legendary. At this earlier point in time, even the hidden wounds that would one day slow him down had not yet taken their toll, and his strength remained nearly at its absolute height. When Nethin unleashed a cross-space strike, Whitebeard intercepted it with effortless ease. Even Nethin's most devastating, spiraling slash was halted in midair. His speed was blistering, his combat instincts razor-sharp, his mastery of his naginata peerless, and his physique an unbreakable fortress. Coupled with the cataclysmic force of the tremor fruit, he stood unrivaled in raw destructive power, save for Nethin himself. Relaxing the colossal muscles in his arms, Whitebeard fixed his gaze on Nethin hovering above the deck. "Even at this stage," he rumbled, voice calm and authoritative, "you're still leagues beyond me." Before the words had fully faded, Whitebeard lunged skyward. Gripping his naginata with both hands, he summoned a titanic shockwave that crackled along the blade. Then, with bone-shaking force, he drove the weapon down toward Nethin's head in a single earth-sundering strike. Nethin's twisting fruit power, like Whitebeard's shaking fruit, distorts flesh and bone, warping arms and torsos with every strike. Yet against Whitebeard there is no endless strength gain, no weapon that grows mightier the more it lands blows. Once Whitebeard seizes the advantage, he can bear his foe back over the brink, leaving no hope of retreat. Victory or defeat hinges on raw power alone. Boom, their attacks meet again, and the impact rips through the sky as if tearing Lydie itself. Whitebeard's overwhelming aura surges outward, intent on engulfing Nethin, while Nethin, refusing to yield, unleashes his own tyrannical presence. At sea today, only red-haired Shanks, Whitebeard, and Nethin himself possess such peerless willpower. Their clashing wills churn the high clouds into a roiling vortex. Dark thunder cracks through the heavens, bolts of black lightning unspooling from the void. This is the fearsome spectacle born of 2 overlord wills in furious collision, absolute domination. From their vantage point, Marco and his fellow captains watched the sky with solemn faces. Though the 2 supreme powers faced off against each other, and neither made a move forward, no one dared show even a flicker of pride in the presence of such titanic strength. After all, Nethin was one of the 4 emperors. It would be stranger if he didn't carry that overlord's bearing. Shilyu of the Rain struck a match, lit another cigar, and studied the colossal duel unfolding between Nethin and Whitebeard. He took a long drag, then exhaled a thick plume of smoke. With a slow, predatory smile, he turned his blood-red eyes toward Marco and the others. "Time to finish them off," he whispered. At Shiryu's words, Admiral Fujitora and the rest of the Marine commanders tore their gazes away from the 2 emperors. They swept their stare down to Marco and his crew. Marco, sensing those eyes upon him, exchanged tense glances with his comrades as they all slowly turned their heads in unison. Under the banners of the Ghost Hand and Whitebeard, the greatest warriors now faced off on the frozen expanse, tens of meters separating them. Frigid breath veiled the air, but it was the clash of wills, dark, potent hockey, that truly made the atmosphere crackle and pulse. As soon as Whitebeard engaged Nethin in combat, the captains of his 6th and 7th divisions sprang from the deck in perfect unison. They landed lightly on the ice and fell in alongside Marco, Jozu, Vista, and the other division commanders, 15 of Whitebeard's proudest lieutenants in all. At the same moment, the Fishman pirates, Lafitte, and the rest slipped their black cloaks into place before marching to join Admiral Fujitora's group, their presence bolstering the Ghost Hand's ranks. No steel had flashed, no devil fruit power yet unleashed, but the tension between the 2 lines was already suffocating. Each side's aura flared outward, twisting the very air with its weight. The Ghost Hand fighters stood shoulder to shoulder, their dark cloaks woven into a single, shadowy tide of intent. Though fewer in number than Whitebeard's captains, their combined haki blazed with such ferocity that it seemed to threaten, even outshine, the famed Yonko's force. On that frozen field, with no one daring to draw the first breath of wind, the stage was set. Two unstoppable tides of power were poised to collide, and nothing would ever be the same again. Though the Whitebeard pirates had been scattered, every one of them was a seasoned veteran, a high-ranking officer drawn from the fiercest crews on the seas. There wasn't a hint of hesitation in their eyes, only a predatory glare. Marco drew a slow breath, his expression cool and unflinching. "Let this be a lesson," he announced, "to anyone who dares lay a hand on our comrades. Finish them." No sooner had the words left his lips than the tension that had been coiling between the two sides snapped like a taut rope. In an instant, Admiral Fujitora, the Rain Lieutenant Shiryu, Helding of the Fishmen, and the rest of their elite moved as one, surging forward. Simultaneously, Marco, Jaws, Satch, Vista, and the other captains charged in, their faces alight with fierce confidence and defiance. The battlefield erupted. Among the ordinary ranks, both Ghost Hand pirates and Whitebeard pirates, a low murmur rippled through the lines. It wasn't born of fear, but of white-hot excitement and the rush of battle fever. Ghost Hand pirates versus Whitebeard pirates. The war had begun. Chapter 331, Fierce Battle. 1,000 kilometers above Iceland, a white bird glided through the air. Affixed to its head was a tiny video camera drone, streaming every moment of the furious clash below to Naval Command, and straight to the world government. Inside the Navy headquarters, martial law had been declared. In the plaza at the foot of the fortress, rows upon rows of naval elites stood at attention, weapons at the ready, prepared to deploy at a moment's notice. "It's still raging down there," Qingji murmured from his office on the top floor. He leaned back in his chair and glanced at Marshal Warring States. "Shall I go in and take a look, Marshal?" Huang Yuan shifted his weight, uneasily meeting the Marshal's gaze. Deep down, he'd hoped to avoid this assignment. Of all the four emperors, Nethan was the one opponent he least wanted to face. Warring States stared at the grainy feed on the monitor, brows furrowed. Then, without warning, a shockwave rippled across the battlefield, and the image abruptly blacked out. Even the world's most advanced surveillance couldn't penetrate the raw power unleashed when the four emperors locked horns. The true scale of their battle was far beyond what any camera could capture. Fleet Admiral Akainu sat alone in the war room, his face carved with tension. The moment he learned that the Ghost Hand pirates and Whitebeard had erupted into all-out war, he knew the Marines could not afford to remain idle. Under normal circumstances, it would take overwhelming force to defeat a single Yonko. Dispatching one or even two admirals rarely guarantees more than a temporary setback, and killing an emperor is almost unheard of. But when two emperors clash, they bleed each other dry, and suddenly the path to victory lies wide open. "Once Whitebeard and Nethan both falter," Akainu mused grimly, "we can strike at minimal cost, crushing the Ghost Hand pirates outright, or perhaps even wiping out both sides at once." Standing nearby, Admiral Jean Guo nodded in solemn agreement. History had taught them that whenever the great powers of the sea devoured one another, the Marines always emerged as the true victors. This was an opportunity they could not pass up. "Sakaska, Palusolino, take command of this operation at once and set sail for the waters off Atwal and Stupert." News of the all-out war between the Whitebeard pirates and the Ghost Hand pirates spread through every major fleet within hours. Frankly, no one was shocked. Neither Nethan nor Whitebeard was the sort to back down. Yet even the veterans couldn't predict how far the clash would ripple through the new world. Boom, boom, boom. Explosions thundered across the sky, echoing for miles above the island of Iceland. On the front line, Admiral Fujitora squared off against Phoenix Marco. Relying on his gravity fruit and overwhelming strength, Fujitora held his ground immovably. Marco found no opening to strike back. Nearby, Shiryu of the Rain advanced on Vesta of the Foil Brigade, only to be stopped cold by Jazzy the Diamond. With both armament haki and the Diamond Fruit's impenetrable shell, Jazzy resisted every assault. Still, the Rain Army's Shiryu, blessed with the cold fruit, managed to gain the edge, chilling the air around his foe. And at the harbor's edge, the fisherman warriors squared off against Sachi in a tense standoff, each waiting for the other to make the first move. All across the battlefield, the clash of devil fruits, haki, and steel promised a war the likes of which the Grand Line had never seen. Both warriors moved with the grace of dancers, their skills so evenly matched that each attack and parry felt like a mirror image of the other. Vista let out a soft laugh as he swept his twin blades in a blinding cross-slash, sending a crackling wave of sword energy hurtling toward Halding's massive frame. But Halding was ready. In an instant, his body blurred into pure lightning, a feat of the natural system's form shift, and he phased through the strike as though it were a mere breeze. The next moment, he reappeared directly, eye before Vista, hoisting a colossal thunder battle axe above his head. With bone-shaking force, he brought it down in a thunderous arc. Vista barely had time to react. He crossed his blades in a horizontal sweep, unleashing a storm of razor-sharp petals that shredded the air around them. The impact rang out like a thunderclap as steel met enchanted metal. Vista's swords tore straight through the axe's haft, but the residual shockwave still slammed him backward, singing his hair and scorching his tunic. Vista staggered, but managed a crooked grin. "I didn't expect you to be such a handful, big guy." Although he smiled, there was none of his usual ease in his eyes. Nethan staggered back, surprised to find himself outpaced. He'd assumed Hilderding's hulking frame would make him slow and predictable, but the giant was as clever as he was strong, and shockingly fast. After a titanic clash of steel, Nethan realized he'd slightly misjudged his opponent. Room. The air in Law's room shimmered like rippling glass. In an instant, Nethan's form blurred and reappeared behind the captain of Whitebeard's 10th Division. Before the man could react, Nethan swung his sword in a brutal arc. Steel bit through flesh with a grisly hiss, and the pirate captain was cleaved in two. He twisted aside at the last heartbeat, pale with shock, a bead of sweat sliding down his temple. Not far off, Nico Robin stood calm amid a sea of Whitebeard pirates. A swirl of purple and red hues blossomed around her, forging 9 identical silhouettes. Her arms crossed in front of her chest, she sent her flower petals in a devastating wave. Each clone radiated armament haki as they dove headlong into the enemy ranks. "Don't lose focus," cackled Lafitte from the shadows. He'd cornered another captain and pressed his polished mahogany cane against the man's shoulder. The pirate managed to parry, but his knees buckled and his face burned with humiliation. All across the battlefield, the young Straw Hats and their allies closed in, determined to end this fight once and for all. Nethan's force was outmatched by the Whitebeard pirates. In sheer numbers of seasoned fighters, the Whitebeard crews eclipsed the 7 detachments under his command. Yet Nethan harbored a secret trump card, an unrivaled war weapon known as the Sandstorm Impact. With a roar, Rhodes, the towering sand giant, transformed. His lower half turned to roiling quicksand, while his torso and arms dissolved into swirling grains. A vast cloud of dust billowed up, blotting out the sky over Iceland's battlefield. Wherever he advanced, mammoth waves of sand, 30 meters high in places, erupted from the ground, crushing or swallowing anything in their wake. Opposing them strode the Steel Titan, a colossal automaton whose forged metal body reached nearly 50 meters tall. From bow to stern, its polished steel plates gleamed ominously. Whitebeard's sharpshooters peppered it with bullets, but each impact merely sparked off the Titan's exterior, leaving its armor unblemished. At the vanguard, a bold captain lunged forward, sword raised high. He brought the blade down on the Titan's calf with a deafening clang, only to find, when he retracted his weapon, a shallow nick in the metal, no larger than a pinprick. To the giant, the captain's effort was as meaningless as a mosquito bite. 2 unstoppable forces, endless sand and unyielding steel, now clashed over the island. Yet Nethan knew the battle had only just begun. The Iron Giant's devil fruit powers weren't as refined as Cracker's biscuit fruit, nor as well developed as Hilden's thunder fruit, but its raw durability had already surpassed even Harrowstone. Add to that its expert use of armament haki, and it was all but invulnerable. Damn. The captain rubbed his throbbing temples as he watched yet another volley of attacks glance harmlessly off the giant's steel frame. How on earth had the Ghost Hand pirates managed to engineer such a relentless beast? Chapter 332, twisting versus striking. Just as Whitebeard's giant core was flexing its muscles, giving his captains and officers plenty of headaches, a vast black shape emerged on the far horizon. It crept ever closer to Iceberg Island until, with a thunderous crack, it shattered the fragile ice along the shore and came to rest on solid ground. Even the largest giants looked like children beside it. Finally, Little Oz is here, the Whitebeard pirates cried out, faces lighting up with excitement as they all cheered. Across the battlefield, the Ghost Hand pirates fell silent, their eyes widening at the newcomer's gargantuan form. "That size?" muttered fishermen in disbelief. The giants were already colossal, but this Little Oz towered over them all. To a skilled marksman, such a hulking target might as well be standing still, but for any ordinary fighter, his sheer mass and strength were utterly overwhelming. No one could forgive him if he harmed their friends. Little Oz planted his massive feet on the ice, looming like a living mountain. Then he let out a bellow so powerful it resonated for hundreds of miles around. Nethin surged forward, his boots thundering against the brittle ice that had blanketed Shiliu's rain-frozen island. With every step, the frosted ground quaked beneath him. When he reached the towering steel giant, he halted only long enough to brace himself, then hoisted his massive cleaver overhead and drove it down in a savage arc. Clang! The blade bit through the giant's helmet and chest, plating as if they were paper, gouging a deep, jagged wound. Yet the steel behemoth barely staggered. This was no ordinary construct, but a superhuman empowered by the metal fruit, its alloy body shrugging off Nethin's raw strength as though it were nothing. Gripping the cleaver's shaft with both colossal hands, the giant unleashed a thunderous roar and heaved, attempting to hurl Nethin aside. The force threatened to uproot him, but Nethin met it with his own defiant bellow. He tightened his grip, dug his feet into the ice, and summoned every ounce of his power. Muscles bulging, he pressed the cleaver downwards with bone-crushing might, determined to sever the steel colossus in two. Sparks flew where blade met armor, and the island itself trembled as their titanic struggle reached a deadly crescendo. The battlefield fell silent as two titanic figures locked in place, their standoff freezing every nearby soul in awe. Then came a crack of steel splitting. Nethin's massive chopping blade at last gave way under the metal colossus's relentless weight and snapped clean in two. Before he could recover, a hulking iron Susanoo, its armor glimmering behind an impenetrable barrier, barreled into Nethin's right leg. He staggered, took 2 frantic steps back, and with a roar of frustration snatched the iron warrior off its feet. With a series of bone-shaking slams, he drove it into the earth, each blow rocking the island. Yet when he paused, both the metal colossus and its iron sentinel stood unharmed. Their barrier fruit defenses shrugged off his raw strength. Only supreme haki or a sealing devil fruit power could penetrate such protection. A twisted grin spread across the metal giant's face as it bellowed in challenge and lunged forward once more, its barrier pulsing with lethal promise. The frozen plains of central Iceland trembled under the weight of battle. Oz, despite his immense power, was pinned down by a wall of towering giants, and beyond them, ghostly hands directed wave after wave of ordinary players into the fray. Just as the two armies ground against each other in a brutal stalemate, 2 earth-shaking detonations ripped through the air. The shockwaves rolled across the ice like a vengeful storm, leaving every combatant reeling. At the heart of that devastation stood Nethin. He gripped his sword's hilt in his left hand, holding the blade horizontally before him. With his right hand, he curled his fingers into a tight, practiced fist. Then, with breathtaking simplicity, he drove his punch straight at his adversary, Whitebeard, the self-proclaimed strongest man on the seas. Whitebeard showed no hint of fear. His broad frame radiated the ruthless confidence of a veteran warrior, and he met Nethin blow for blow. Boom, the very void between them shattered. As Nethin's twisted power plunged downward, the air in front of him began to whirl like a vortex. Simultaneously, Whitebeard's counterstrike cleaved space itself, sending a thunderous shockwave rippling across the battlefield. In that moment, neither fighter held any advantage. Whitebeard's strength matched his fearsome reputation, every strike owned by countless bloody clashes, while Nethin's raw power and precision proved he was more than a match for legend. Nethin thought, He isn't reckless like Kaido, nor does he rely on brute strength the way Big Mom does. Yet compared to his prime at the Paramount War, Whitebeard has clearly lost some of his edge. He can't even evade surprise strikes from his own son, or withstand assaults from Akainu and Kizaru as easily as before. An aging legend like this is still frightening, of course. But Nethan's own power had grown in leaps and bounds. Had he faced Kaido back then, he might have been outmatched by Whitebeard. Now, however, he'd improved in every way: speed, precision, and above all, raw destructive force. At this moment, his offensive prowess rivaled, perhaps even surpassed, that of the old man before him. Boom! A brilliant flash filled the air. Nethan staggered back as Whitebeard drove his Naginata's shaft deep into the ground, anchoring himself against the blast. The Pirate King's face remained impassive, but inside, he couldn't help a small sigh. Time spares no one, and age had slowly eroded the explosive power of his prime. His conqueror's haki still radiated more dominion than Nethan's, but in sheer ferocity, the younger man's devil fruit-enhanced strikes were now the more dangerous of the two. Nethan knew he couldn't face Whitebeard's full strength head-on. He'd be overwhelmed in an instant. Still, he had one gamble left. In a voice that cut through the frozen air, he shouted, "Sky Splitter!" and charged. This wasn't the composed, calculating elder he'd heard of, but a younger Whitebeard bristling with fierce energy. Nethan planted his feet, gripped his sword with both hands, and stepped forward. In the next heartbeat, he seemed to split into 6 identical figures, each one launching a downward slash from a different angle. Whitebeard merely snorted. He set his Naginata's shaft against the ice, calmly turned his fists outward, and slammed both hammers to the sides in a wide arc. The impact rang like shattering glass, each blow striking nothing but thin air, and yet the surrounding surface cracked as if he'd struck solid ice. Powerful shock waves rippled outward. Boom, 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 boom. All 6 slashes struck the invisible barrier at once, and all were repelled. Without missing a beat, Whitebeard seized his blade's handle and swung it in a devastating backhand at the very spot where Nethan's 6th illusion flickered into form. In that split second, the young swordsman's 6-fold attack lay broken, and he reappeared, unguarded, beneath Whitebeard's arc. But Nethan's keen senses tracked every twitch of Whitebeard's stance, yet it was his uncanny ability to foresee the future that truly set him apart. He'd already anticipated the old captain's thrust, so the instant the Naginata arced toward him, Nethan pivoted sharply to one side. As Whitebeard's blade whooshed past, Nethan's elbow snapped out, driving into the gap beneath the weapon's path with bone-shaking force. The impact rang like thunder. Whitebeard's arms clashed together over the shaft of his polearm, too late to withdraw for another strike and unable to retaliate with a fist. Staggering, he was thrown off balance, forced onto the defensive as Nethan's unexpected blow left him reeling, and for the first time, clearly on the back foot. Chapter 333, The Final Battle at the Peak. Father, how is this possible? A stunned hush fell over the Whitebeard pirates as they watched their captain, Edward Newgate, the mighty Whitebeard, stagger beneath the blows of a single young man. The impossible was happening. Someone was driving back Papa Whitebeard in a one-on-one fight. Some crewmen stared in utter disbelief. Not even the fearsome beast Kaido had managed such a feat when he challenged Whitebeard to duel. Kaido had been forced into retreat by the sheer might of Whitebeard's fists. Now here stood Nethan, formerly known as Ross, pushing the world's strongest man onto the defensive. Each thunderous punch and sweeping kick forced Whitebeard to yield ground. The sea echoes with the impact of their clash, and even hardened pirates felt their hearts pound to its rhythm. On the deck above, Marco the Phoenix, Whitebeard's trusted first mate and doctor, watched with mounting alarm. He knew better than anyone the true state of Whitebeard's health. Although the old man's legendary endurance still held, his body had taken countless blows over the years. Internal injuries, though not yet critical, were accumulating. At 20 years younger, Whitebeard would have never flinched under such sustained assault. Now, beads of sweat tracked down his weathered face as he forced himself back to his feet after each strike. Marco clenched his fist. "Stay strong, Captain," he whispered, though his voice quavered with worry. Around him, the crew crowded forward, eyes wide, breaths caught in their throats, their loyal commander, the very pillar of their family, on the brink of being overwhelmed for the first time in living memory. Atop the summit of the island, Nethin steadied his stance. The wind whipped through his hair, carrying the smoke of cannon fire and the cries of battle. His gaze never left Whitebeard's battered form. Every fiber of his being pulsed with the certainty that this clash would decide the fate not only of these two titans, but of the entire pirate world. Below them, the battle raged on the sea and shore. Allies and enemies alike paused as the two giants prepared for their next exchange. The world held its breath. This was the final battle at the peak, and only one could emerge victorious. Nethin's blade recoiled, but Whitebeard showed no sign of frustration. Clutching his naginata with renewed fervor, the veteran warrior let out a thunderous roar and lunged forward. Decades of combat had taught him that even the strongest were not invincible, but through countless battles, he had fought his way to the top. He couldn't recall exactly when he'd first earned the title of unbeatable, only that every defeat he'd suffered in youth had been avenged in time, leaving his adversaries vanquished at his feet. With a sharp clang, Whitebeard's naginata crashed into the void itself, shattering the air before Nethin like broken glass. A shockwave ripped outward, bearing down on Nethin with terrifying force. Unfazed, Nethin met the assault head-on. He swept his sword in a single elegant arc, the blade wreathed in a twisting, palpable energy. The very atmosphere seemed to buckle and tear beneath his strike, fine cracks radiating outward in a spiderweb of destruction. The aftershock rippled across the frozen battlefield, sending fissures spidering across the ice. In the next heartbeat, Nethin stepped forward, crossing the broken space as though he'd simply teleported. He materialized before Whitebeard, sword raised in a poised, decisive gesture, ready to press his advantage and determine the victor of this titanic clash. A low hum rippled through the air as gravity itself twisted around Whitebeard, yanking him off his feet. In an instant, he found himself suspended, and then hurtling straight at Nethin. Even enveloped in that strange force, Whitebeard's features remained unreadable. His eyes darkened, and with a single motion, his massive right fist clenched and swung. The impact sounded like a gunshot, void shattered, but Nethin was ready. He met Whitebeard's blow, with a powerful punch of his own. The two shocks collided in midair, tearing the atmosphere apart in a series of earth-shaking detonations. Whitebeard recoiled, and Nethin seized the moment. He drew his sword in one fluid motion and slashed. Whitebeard, still airborne, answered with a sweeping arc of his naginata. Steel met steel above the ice, and the force drove Whitebeard backward. He crashed onto the frozen ground, the ice cracking a foot beneath him. Nethin sheathed his sword and stepped forward, gaze cold. You can no longer claim the title of strongest, Whitebeard. On the jagged ice, Whitebeard struggled to rise. Even though Nethin was smaller, the intensity of his stance made the very air feel heavy, marking a shift in power that neither man would soon forget. Nethin felt like the gathering shadow that swallows the world as the sun dips below the horizon, inevitable, unstoppable. If Whitebeard thought he could stand in his way, he was welcome to try. The old man remained eerily composed, his right arm bulging with muscle as he gripped the naginata, an impressive sight for someone of his years, when most would have long since weakened. Without another word, Whitebeard and Nethin let out simultaneous battle cries and lunged at each other. Nethin refused to squander his strength on fancy footwork or theatrics against a veteran like Whitebeard, whose single punch or blade stroke could pierce any defense. Direct confrontation was his best strategy. By meeting Whitebeard head-on, Nethin could rely on the one advantage he still possessed: pure, unrestrained speed. And in that moment, he intended to prove it. When two fighters' power is evenly matched, speed becomes the deciding factor. In their relentless exchange, Nethin's blows always landed just a fraction of a second before Whitebeard's. Each collision rang out like thunder over the ice, a rapid-fire barrage of fists and knives that threatened to shatter the arena itself. After an untold number of strikes, Nethin saw his opening. With a burst of acceleration, his fist whipped around Whitebeard's guard. Whitebeard managed only a half-hearted parry, arms locking together to meet the onslaught. But Nethin's punch carried such force that it drove his opponent backward. Ice splintered beneath Whitebeard's feet, sending him skidding 4 meters before he came to a halt, two jagged cracks radiating from where he stood, like furrows carved by an iron plow. Before Whitebeard could recover, Nathan pressed the attack. Every fiber of his being bore down on his adversary, intent on ending the fight in one final burst. Both warriors understood the truth in that instant. If the duel continued on its current path, Nathan would inevitably prevail. With a roar, Whitebeard dug his heel into the ice. The floor shuddered violently as the entire layer of frozen ground fractured. A shockwave erupted and barreled toward Nathan, splinters of ice spraying like deadly shrapnel. Nathan braced himself for the impact, ready to withstand or evade whatever desperate gamble his opponent had unleashed. The next moment would decide it all. Nathan's body snapped upright, and he rocketed into the sky, utterly unfazed by the shockwave that rippled out from Whitebeard below. As he climbed, he planted both hands firmly on his sword's hilt, drawing every ounce of his twisting power into the blade's edge. "Burial sword," he howled. A maelstrom of chaotic energy coalesced around the sword, warping the air into a writhing mass before he drove it downward in a blistering arc. The very fabric of space quivered under the strike, making its path nearly impossible to track with normal sight. Whitebeard braced himself, his expression growing solemn. Clutching his naginata, he unleashed the full might of his Quake Fruit power, an ability that bent the earth and sky to his will. With a thunderous roar, he met Nathan's blade with a counterstrike he called Air Shock. For a heartbeat, sound itself vanished. Two of the most cataclysmic forces in the world, the Burial Sword's twisted vortex and the Quake Root's seismic fury, collided in midair. The shock was so immense that it swallowed the world in silence before reality itself seemed to buckle under the blow. On the battlefield, warriors like Marco and Shiryu of the Rain froze mid-strike, all eyes darting toward Whitebeard and Nathan. Time itself seemed to stretch and contract as their opposing powers collided, churning the air into a deep, pitch-black vortex that threatened to swallow everything. Even seasoned fighters felt their hearts pound at the vortex's sheer intensity. At last, the swirling darkness dispersed. High above the ground floated Nathan, his black cloak shredded at the edges, the demon sword Muramame still gripped in his hand. Below him, Whitebeard's massive naginata, once raised in a triumphant arc, began its slow descent. A single silent bead of blood traced from the corner of Whitebeard's mouth. That one earth-shaking clash, born of both warriors unleashing every reserve of strength, had settled the outcome. Whitebeard staggered under the impact, his naginata dipping, while Nathan remained perfectly steadied in midair. In that moment, the verdict was unmistakable. Nathan's strike had been the stronger. Chapter 334, Who is the Strongest? A bitter sea breeze swept across the jagged coast of Iceland, sharpening the already frigid air. Nathan hovered in midair, his cloak ragged and torn, the tattered edges beating softly in the wind. From this vantage point, he studied the towering figure below, Whitebeard, his great white beard whipping in the gale. If only I could have faced him 20 years ago, Nathan mused. Back then, the outcome might have been uncertain. Whitebeard was in his prime, radiating raw power. Now, despite the scars of countless battles, the legendary pirate still stood undefeated. Then again, no one can remain at the summit forever. Even a titan like Whitebeard must one day fall. Whitebeard's eyes, as cold and unyielding as a winter storm, locked onto Nathan. Not a muscle twitched in discouragement. The old pirate's spirit blazed as fiercely as ever. He brought his hand to his side, fingers splaying outward before curling into a single, devastating fist. With a thunderous crack that rattled the cliffs, Whitebeard unleashed his blow. Boom! Nathan lifted his hand and triggered the distortion field, deflecting Whitebeard's massive strike. His face remained impassive as he slipped into combat stance. In the next instant, he blurred to the Pirate King's right flank and swung his sword in a vicious downward arc. Whitebeard met the blow with his basento, metal screeching on metal, but he was already off balance, wounded by that first perfect strike. Across the battlefield, Marco, Jaws, Vista, and the other commanders watched in stunned silence. Whitebeard's bellows, once the heart of their courage, now sounded hollow, each roar a grim reminder that their leader was faltering. They all knew the truth. Unless Whitebeard could somehow reclaim his youth and reverse time, this fight was slipping into despair. "I have to help him." Marco gasped, staggering under Admiral Fujitora's crushing gravity. Flames of blue phoenix fire coiled around his arm as he forced himself to strike again and again at Fujitora's invisible barrier. Clang! Clang! Each blow rang out like a desperate plea for their father's salvation. Fujitora's blade flashed through the air, intercepting every strike Marco launched. Then, with a single reverse sweep, he unleashed a surge of gravity so fierce it crushed Marco's form into smoldering blue flames. The fireball rose, coalescing 10 meters overhead into a magnificent phoenix, its wings unfurled, poised to dive straight at Whitebeard. But Fujitora was already airborne, sword in hand, landing calmly between Marco and his fallen comrade. "Stand aside," he commanded, his voice as unyielding as steel. Marco snapped his jaw shut and rushed forward in a last-ditch effort. Fujitora met him with a precise slash that sent him crashing back to the deck. "You know there's no point in argument," the Admiral said quietly. "No one gets through." Pain and fury contorted Marco's face. He couldn't outflank Fujitora, and yet he refused to yield. Drawing on the Phoenix's reborn undead essence, he hurled himself at Fujitora once more, determined to drive the Admiral back by sheer force of will. Fujitora squared off against Marco's relentless assault. Though his brow darkened, he never lunged in recklessness. Instead, he met each flaming strike with a deft parry of sword and cane, retreating only when necessary. It looked as if he'd been driven to the ropes, but in truth, he'd anchored himself so expertly that not even the Phoenix's blazing wings could find a gap. Boom! On the other side of the deck, Nethan and Whitebeard collided in yet another titanic clash. Their fists rocked the ship, but in the end, the Yonko was forced to yield ground once more. "Father!" Jaws bellowed as he charged to Nethan's aid. With a sweeping blow, he sent Shiryu of the Rain sprawling several meters and then sprinted toward the fray. Shiryu only sneered, his blade dripping frost. Without warning, ice erupted around Jaws' feet, freezing his legs solid. Clack! Jaws thrashed, desperate to break free, but Shiryu's sword found its maw, arc first. A cold, precise slash tore across Jaws' back, carving a crimson streak as it sent him crashing through the air. Jaws planted his feet and raised his diamond-forged shield, the reinforced gauntlets on his arms shining with raw power. From the front, he could barely withstand Shiryu of the Rain's relentless onslaught, but to take that same sword stroke squarely on his unshielded back and walk away unhurt? Impossible. "Damn it," Sak growled, juggling a lit firecracker in one hand and a short sword in the other as he rushed to bolster Whitebeard's flank. But Fisherman's blade came at him too fast. All he could do was scramble to deflect and dodge. "You slipped up a moment ago," Fisherman taunted, voice calm as a summer breeze. Before Sak could brace himself, the assassin closed the gap, driving a kick into Sak's side. Sak's aura flared. It clung around his waist like molten metal, but still the kick sent him flying horizontally. He slammed into the ground hard. His face went pale. Blood seeped from the corner of his mouth. Boom! A crack of steel on steel echoed as Nethan lunged in, sword whistling through the air. Fisherman fell back, and Whitebeard took a step to safety. "Father!" Bista's voice cracked with fear and fury. He barked in order, teeth gritted, and surged toward Whitebeard, as though to shield him himself. But a blinding flash of lightning split the sky. In an instant, a towering thunder giant, over 100 meters tall, veins coursing with incandescent white lightning, materialized in front of Bista, its roar shaking the very earth. Bista skidded to a halt, chest heaving, and the giant's crackling form blocked any hope of advance. This is Helding's ultimate form, the incarnation of thunder at 300 million volts, an upgrade over Thor's 200 million volt output. His entire frame crackles with raw electricity, and every movement sends shockwaves roaring out like rolling thunder. Boom! Helding's fist slams forward, unleashing a cataclysmic storm of lightning that engulfs Vista. The captain brings his sword up, hacking at the raging tempest, but Helding emits a deep, feral growl. In an instant, the crackling bolts coalesce into a snarling thunder beast that lunges and swallows Vista whole. Across the battlefield, no one can truly aid Whitebeard, neither the senior captains nor the junior ones. Apart from the very top officers like Vista, every captain ranked 6th or lower is effectively powerless. They might manage to withstand the aftershocks of Helding's attacks, but they stand no chance against a direct hit. At Nethin's current level of strength, any frontal blow would annihilate them in an instant. Boom, boom, boom. The relentless cacophony of battle continues. Nearly a full day and night have passed since it began, and still neither side shows any sign of relenting. Whitebeard's massive torso was a roadmap of bruises and sprains, the twisted arcs of Nethin's attacks still visible in reddened skin. Thin trails of blood marked the cuts left by his blade. Opposite him, Nethin's once black cloak hung in tatters, half shredded, it now draped over his shoulders like a ragged mantle. Yet Nethin himself bore not a single wound. It wasn't that his healing gift had erased every injury, Whitebeard simply had never managed to land a blow. Nethin moved with a speed that outpaced even Whitebeard. His color of knowledge fruit granted fleeting glimpses of the future, while the distortion fruit's power could neutralize Whitebeard's crushing force outright. So long as Nethin stayed focused, no attack could touch him. As the duel wore on, the stalemate began to tip. Whitebeard's disadvantage grew more obvious with each exchange, and among the Whitebeard pirates, a heavy unease settled in. Their captain was the heart of their strength. Now, watching him battered and unable to strike back, even the fiercest fighters found their resolve shaken. Without a triumphant Whitebeard at their center, they could not wage war with steady hearts. Aboard the Ghost Hand Pirates' flagship, the air practically trembled with excitement. Crewmen surged forward, their triumphant shouts rippling across the deck. Never before had morale run so high. At the center of it all stood their captain, Captain Nethin, the fearsome Ghost Hand. Not yet 30 years old, he had just accomplished the unthinkable. He had defeated Whitebeard, the strongest man in the world. Whitebeard, one of the three great legends who once ruled the seas by sheer might, lay vanquished. For decades, sailors spoke his name with reverence, but today that era came crashing down. A new power had emerged. Captain Nethin, still a relative newcomer, now stood poised to claim the title Whitebeard once held. As the waves thundered against the hull, every Ghost Hand pirate realized they were witnessing a turning point in history. The fall of one emperor and the rise of another would be recorded in the annals of the Grand Line. And here, amid cheers and fluttering flags, each member of the crew helped write that new legend, stroke by stroke. Chapter 335, The Final Blow. Time slipped by as day gave way to night. On the frozen isle, shaped and reinforced by Shiliu of the Rain, thunder and unexpected flashes of light danced across the ice. At the edge of Whitebeard's territory, the tide seemed to turn in his favor. Nearly 20 Whitebeard pirate ships surged onto the horizon, while the Ghost Hand pirates could only muster 4. Yet despite the reinforcements, Whitebeard's victory remained elusive. In the heart of the battlefield, he was locked in single combat with Nethin, and no ally could breach that frozen arena. It was exactly as Nethin intended. By synchronizing his power with Shiliu of the Rain through the Ice Knight ability, he had fused himself with the island itself. Every time Shiliu's ice magic flared, the island's walls grew stronger, sealing Whitebeard within an ever-tightening fortress of frost. With no room to maneuver, the Pirate King found himself at a grave disadvantage. Now, as thunder rumbled overhead, Nethin prepared to deliver the finishing strike. The sky darkened, and an oppressive aura, his Devil's Light technique, stifled Shiliu's storm magic from afar, leaving only residual crackles of energy coiling around him. Within this defiant space, Whitebeard faced the unrelenting assault of ice and lightning. Each time Whitebeard smashed free of the trembling dome above him, new shards of razor-sharp ice rained down, slicing into his flesh. Previous blows had already etched blood-red cracks across his chest, and every collapse was met by another tempest of rainbow-hued lightning, magnified by the Ice Knight's pressurized field. With each strike, Whitebeard's legendary endurance strained further. The pirate lord gritted his teeth and forced himself back to his feet, eyes blazing with defiance. Yet his strength was ebbing fast. A frigid wind whispered through the battlefield as Nethin spread his arms, channeling both ice and lightning in flawless harmony. Whitebeard, Nethin's voice cut through the storm, cold and unyielding. This ends here. At his command, Shiliu's ice magic surged again, thickening the walls of the frozen dome. In that now cramped crucible, Nethin unleashed dozens of lightning bolts in rapid succession. They snapped through the air like living serpents, battering Whitebeard with relentless force. The Pirate King dropped to his knees, arms braced against the ice. Blood bubbled at his lips, his breathing coming in ragged gasps. Disbelief and desperation twisted his features as his hands slipped from the wall. Above him, the ice dome reformed, ready to crush him once more. Summoning every ounce of will, Whitebeard roared. The island trembled, and the surrounding ice exploded in a storm of shards. The radiant fortress shattered, snow humming in its wake. Yet Nethin was merciless. His devil's light converged like a pack of thunderous beasts, striking again and again. Whitebeard barely parried the first salvo. The second wave ignited fresh pain in his arm. The third blow cleaved through him, carving another deep gash across his chest. He staggered, blood streaming from a wound on his forehead, his aura flickering like a dying torch. Red mist clouded his vision as he stared up at Nethin, the world's strongest pirate, reduced to his final, desperate stand. Silence fell. The storm abated, leaving only the echo of Whitebeard's last defiant roar. Over the ruined ice and shattered magic, Nethin stood victorious, his Ice Knight and Devil's Light having sealed the Pirate King's fate. And with that, the age of Whitebeard drew to its monumental close. Nethin squared off against Whitebeard just as the legendary pirate unleashed his full power. None of Whitebeard's crew, save his 5 strongest captains, dared draw near. The aftershocks alone would have shredded any ordinary combatant. Boom, boom. From the rear, the Whitebeard pirates hurled bizarre attacks, mystic lights, suddenly colossal cannon shells, but each assault stalled in midair, snuffed out by the warping aura that rippled outward from Nethin. A low cry escaped Nethin's lips as he twisted gravity to his will. The frozen ground beneath Whitebeard shattered into 1,000 glittering shards, rising like a cage of ice around the pirate lord. Crack! With a roar, Whitebeard shattered his crystalline prison. But the moment he was free, Nethin's sword swept in, bluntly driving him backward. Even someone of Whitebeard's legendary standing, whose strength marginally outstripped Nethin's, could not break through this advantage. He could only weather the onslaught as Nethin steadily expanded his dominance. And so the minutes stretched on, each one tightening the noose around Whitebeard's reputation and his future. After 2 grueling days and nights of relentless combat, even Whitebeard's legendary might showed the toll of age. Each swing of his massive weapon lacked the effortless power it once had. Worse still, Nethin's unceasing onslaught had carved deep, ghastly wounds into the great pirate's colossal frame, leaving him drenched in blood. And yet Whitebeard refused to yield. His once snowy beard was now streaked crimson, but it clung stubbornly to his chin. His eyes burned with fierce resolve, and instead of diminishing, his aura swelled, like a demon bathed in gore. From the corner of his vision, Nethin watched Whitebeard stand tall, unbowed by pain. He remembered the old legend, how Whitebeard had suffered near-fatal injuries, yet nearly annihilated Blackbeard in return. The memory filled Nethin's heart with admiration, not fear. That respect only steeled Nethin's own resolve. If Whitebeard's spirit was iron, then Nethin's would be adamantine. If Whitebeard's strength towered above all, Nethin's would rise even higher. He vowed to bend the world beneath his feet. With a thunderous roar, Nethin hurled himself back into the fray. Blow after blow crashed against Whitebeard's battered defenses, each impact rocking the deck and sending jets of blood into the air. Yet the old pirate answered every strike, his stance unbroken, driven by the pure force of his indomitable will. Even as the planks beneath them ran red and the sea breeze carried the stench of iron, Whitebeard fought on, a living testament to a will no wound could conquer. Whitebeard's aging body could no longer endure such an unrelenting, high-intensity duel. "Father, that scoundrel Ghost Hand!" he bellowed, voice ragged. His pirate crew gathered at the edges of the frozen battlefield, hearts pounding, yet none dared break formation to intervene. The struggle had raged through 2 nights and 2 days, and now the pale light of the third dawn crept over the ice. With a thunderous crack, the frozen surface split open beneath them. Nethin sprang forward, vaulting cleanly over the yawning fissure and landing nimbly on the far side, sword at the ready. Whitebeard stumbled back, chest heaving, sweat and frost clinging to his beard. Though Nethin had already spent 2/3 of his strength, he still had enough reserves to fight on. Whitebeard, by contrast, was utterly spent. Every fierce strike over the past days had drained him to his last breath. Outwardly, He seemed as formidable as ever, but in truth, his body clung to consciousness by sheer force of will. Nethan steadied himself, lifting Murasame until its blade hovered before his rival. A faint red glow crept along the edge, casting an unsettling aura across the ice. In that charged silence, both warriors braced for the final decisive blow. Nethan stood his ground, meeting the old man's gaze with unshaken calm. He didn't lunge forward. Instead, he planted his feet and began to draw in energy, focusing every ounce of strength into a single, decisive strike. If he let this battle drag on, there was no telling how much longer Whitebeard's unbridled fury would last. The only way to end it now was with one final blow. Whitebeard's great chest heaved as he panted, sweat glistening on his brow. He sensed Nethan's intent immediately and understood what was coming. The young man was gathering power for a finishing attack. Yet there was nothing he could do to stop it. If he rushed forward, Han could simply sidestep. If he held back, he wouldn't prevent the onslaught. Was this truly the end? The old pirate's eyes drifted skyward, first to the space just behind Nethan, then to the boundless heavens above them. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted Marco and the others locked in fierce combat, fighting desperately to reach him. Their path, however, was blocked. Admiral Fujitora and the rest of the Navy had formed an impenetrable cordon. Not one of his allies could break through. A cold dread settled over Whitebeard as he realized just how isolated he'd become. His muscles ached, his breath came in ragged gasps, and his spirit teetered on exhaustion. Every fiber of his being felt hollow. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, steeling himself against the inevitable. Nethan's aura flared brighter, the air around him humming with latent power. The moment had come. With a roar that echoed across the battlefield, he unleashed his charge, an earth-shaking blow intended to bring the legendary Whitebeard to his knees once and for all. Nethan's body looked like dry, rotting wood. No matter how you pressed or prodded, not a spark of life seemed to remain. Whitebeard fixed him with a gaze that defied easy description, imperious yet still, feral yet controlled, laced with a deep dissatisfaction. But it wasn't anger at Nethan he felt. It was a challenge hurled at age, at time, at the world, and at the sea itself. Not here, not now, would he yield. Whitebeard's eyes drifted to Marco and the others, drawing strength from their presence. Suddenly, from his withered frame, a torrent of power erupted, unyielding, unrelenting, as if determined to crush everything before it. Tendons in his arms stood out like iron cables as he clasped the Naginata's shaft. Energy rippled through him in savage waves. Opposite him, Nethan felt his own power stir, swelling like a rising tide until it brimmed at the edges of his control. A sharp light flashed behind Nethan's eyes. Whitebeard might have resurrected his strength through sheer force of will, but Nethan was whole, fresh, unmarked by battle, a decisive edge that could not be denied. In this moment, the advantage belonged to him. Both warriors braced themselves, the calm before the storm hanging heavy in the air. Even if Whitebeard drew on every last ounce of strength, so what? If he, arguably the world's strongest man, couldn't win, how could anyone hope to topple an 800-year-old world government? With a whoosh of wind, Nethan surged forward. He gripped his sword's hilt with both hands, the blade's edge crackling with a twisted, almost sky-shredding energy as he swung upward at the towering pirate. Whitebeard met the attack without a scream or a word. His massive Naginata, locked in both hands, descended in a single earth-shaking chop. An unprecedented aura flared around him, so immense it felt capable of smashing mountains in two. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to vanish. All color drained away, leaving only the clash of steel and spirit, the black gleam of Nethan's sword against the blinding halo of Whitebeard's blade. Fujitora froze mid-lift. Marco stilled in mid-step. Shiryu of the Rain halted, rain droplets suspended in mid-air. On every front of the battlefield, swords paused, gazes locked. Every soul there understood they weren't just witnessing a duel, they stood breathless at the very center of destiny. Chapter 336, The Navy Arrives. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Nethan's sword sliced through the air, wrapped in coiling power that dragged like a blade through thick mud. Opposite him, Whitebeard's Naginata swept in a sweeping half-moon arc, its weight driving it down with brutal force. Under a sky heavy with clouds and watched by countless eyes, blade met polearm in a single thunderous collision. For a heartbeat, the heavens themselves trembled, as though the very sky had been torn open. This was no ordinary strike, but the culmination of both warriors' full might, an arrogant display of strength, so intense it sundered earth and atmosphere alike. A sharp crack rang out, like a pane of glass shattering. At the point where Nethan's Murasame met Whitebeard's Naginata, the swirling energies gouged fissures into the surrounding space, stretching and kneading it as if it were soft clay. Nethan roared, his hair wild and tousled by the force of the clash. The air around him shimmered with raw, visible power, his indomitable will made manifest in every crackling strand of energy. In that fierce instant, the two champions pushed each other to their absolute limits, and the world held its breath. Whitebeard's arm shook violently under the sheer weight of his own power as he drove his Naginata down toward Nethan. The air rippled with seismic energy, every vibration promising to shatter everything it touched. Opposing him, Nethan's aura writhed and contorted, a twisting force that bent and unraveled matter at its foundation. For a tense few heartbeats, which felt like both an instant and an eternity, the two energies crashed against each other. Whitebeard's quaking force fought to pulverize all in its path, while Nethan's distorting power strove to bend and collapse that very force. Gradually, the balance shifted. Inch by inch, Nethan's twisting energy cracked through the quake's resistance, allowing him to surge forward. Then, with a fierce cry, Nethan spun his blade in a sweeping arc. Clang! The clash of steel rang out across the battlefield as his sword slammed into Whitebeard's shaft. In one decisive motion, he wrenched the Naginata from the pirate's grip, sending it skittering aside. At the same moment, his twisting aura unraveled the last tremors of Whitebeard's shockwave. The legendary quake power shattered completely. Breathing hard, Nethan didn't sheath Shigur. Instead, he opened his right hand and let the dissipating strands of his power coalesce once more in midair. Then, gathering every last twist of energy, he drove his fist straight into Whitebeard's chest. Boom! Whitebeard staggered, and the battlefield fell silent. Nethan's devastating strike shattered Whitebeard's defense in an instant. The great Naginata flew from his grasp as if repelled by an invisible force, its shaft splintering beneath the impact. With a thunderous boom, Nethan's fist connected squarely with Whitebeard's chest. The legendary pirate's massive frame buckled, folding in on itself like a falling star. Crimson blood gushed from his mouth as he was launched backward. "Father!" Marco and the others cried out, their voices cracking with horror. Whitebeard hurtled through the air, tumbling end over end across the battlefield. He crossed nearly 1,000 meters before finally slamming onto the slippery ice at the water's edge. Simultaneously, his Naginata spun loose in a wide arc, clanging wildly before coming to rest in the frozen surf. Silence fell over the sea. 18 years into the Great Pirate Era, the Ghost Hand Pirates and the Whitebeard Pirates had clashed off Atwal and Stewport. Later historians would call this confrontation the Battle of Atwal. It was here that one of the era's 3 legendary pirates, Edward Whitebeard Newgate, met his unprecedented defeat. From this day forward, the title of strongest man in the world no longer belonged to Whitebeard. It had passed into the hands of a new legend, one of the 4 emperors, the Ghost Hand, Nethan. Not far from the frozen shores of Iceland, where Nethan and Whitebeard's titanic clash had just reached its crescendo, a squadron of 10 marine warships materialized on the horizon, too late to influence the outcome. On the forecastle of the lead vessel, Admiral Okiji stood draped in the unyielding mantle of naval justice, his gaze fixed on the distant isle. Whitebeard and the Ghost Hand, he thought. Truly terrifying. Sub-Lieutenant Huang Yuan, standing beside him, could only murmur in disbelief. Even at this remove, the aftershocks of their collision had hammered against his chest. If he'd been caught at the epicenter, he wouldn't be standing here now. Lieutenant Qingji drew in a slow, cold breath and spoke under his voice. "It's over. Whitebeard's aura is fading. The Ghost Hand has won." Qingji's thoughts drifted back to that first encounter with Nethan. Discovered alone in the Devil's Triangle, the young admiral had faced the notorious Ghost Hand pirates with calm resolve and strategic brilliance. Yet it was in the midst of that deadly maelstrom that Nethan had gone even further, rescuing Lafitte, Robin, and the others in a way no one could have foreseen. Tonight, Every Marine aboard these ships would bear witness to the rise of a new emperor. Nethin had tapped into his devil fruit power in a way no one saw coming. By the time we realized something was wrong and scrambled our forces, he had already vanished into the rolling mists of the Devil's Triangle. From there, he slipped into Dressrosa, confronted and killed Doflamingo, only to be captured moments later by the Navy and thrown into Advanced City Prison. But that didn't stop him. He broke out, laid waste to the city, and even struck at Navy headquarters before disappearing again. Where had we gone wrong? Aokiji replayed the entire sequence in his mind. If only he'd unleashed his full strength the moment Nethin showed a flicker of power in the triangle, maybe the boy would never have grown into the threat he'd become. But there are no do-overs in this world. Now Nethin sits among the 4 emperors of the sea. Moments ago, he toppled Whitebeard, long hailed as the world's strongest, and claimed that title for himself. The balance of power has shifted in an instant. "It's our turn to move," Aokiji said quietly. Huang Yuan, less weighed down by regrets, inhaled deeply and let a slow, leering grin spread across his face. His eyes glittered with dark excitement as he spoke, his tone low and chillingly amused. Nethin had finally defeated Whitebeard, and both the Whitebeard and Ghost Hand pirate crews were all but spent. Their 3-day, 3-night clash had drained them of nearly every resource, and now was the Navy's chance. Even if they couldn't wipe out both fleets in a single strike, they could cripple them so badly that one of the notorious 4 great pirate armadas might vanish forever. Aokiji blinked back to full awareness and stared toward the target island, known simply as Iceland. "Now," he rumbled, "we strike." Below him, a squadron of 10 warships bore down on Iceland's icy shores. As their lead vessel crossed into bombardment range, the Marine Lieutenant General on deck lifted his hand and barked, "Open fire! Annihilate the Ghost Hand and Whitebeard pirates." In an instant, every cannon along the flotilla thundered to life. Enormous shells screamed through the sky, smashing against the island's frozen bulwarks. Chunks of ice shattered and spray flew skyward, mingling with the acrid haze of gunpowder. Though both pirate crews were still fearsome opponents, the Navy officers knew exactly how worn out their enemies were. After nearly 72 hours of relentless combat, Whitebeard's men and the Ghost Hands had no strength left to mount more than a desperate defense. This barrage would finish the job and secure a defining victory for the world government. General Qingji and General Huang Yuan stood at the forefront of the fleet, their banners snapping in the icy wind. Flanking them were the 2 infamous lieutenant generals, Taotu and Chafu, warriors whose reputations struck fear into any who heard their names. On the quarter-deck, Vice Admiral Nethin raised his gleaming sword. His voice cut through the thunder of cannon fire, sharp and cold. "No quarter. Every pirate is to be executed on the spot." At his command, thousands of naval officers roared their assent. Steel rang as sabers were drawn, and boots thundered on the deck. The fleet closed on Iceland's shore with unstoppable momentum, sailors spilling onto the frozen ground in perfect formation. From this moment forward, the battlefield belonged to Admiral Nethin's navy. Chapter 337, Peach Rabbit's Swordsmanship. "Father!" Marco cried, morphing into his phoenix form and launching himself toward Whitebeard. To everyone's surprise, Fujitora made no attempt to hold him back. Almost driven mad, Marco tore through the Admiral's gravitational pressure and reached Whitebeard in an instant. "Cough!" Whitebeard clutched his chest as blood spurted from his mouth, each crimson drop splattering across the ice. Marco knelt beside him and plunged his undying flame into the wound. He knew his immortal fire couldn't fully heal another's injuries, but it could at least halt the bleeding and prevent the damage from worsening. With a groan of exertion, Whitebeard hauled himself to his feet. Marco hovered anxiously at his side. "How are you, Dad?" he asked. Whitebeard waved off his concern, opening his mouth to answer when the sky erupted in thunderous cracks. Dozens of cannon shells descended from the horizon, smashing into the ice with earth-shattering force. "Damn it!" Marco hissed, eyes narrowing. "The Navy's opened fire!" Marco glanced back and froze. Overnight, a substantial portion of the Navy fleet had slipped into Iceland's waters. He ground his teeth in frustration. Whitebeard lay gravely wounded, exhausted after his duel with Nethin, and every sailor within sight was spent from the prolonged battle. The sudden arrival of the Navy was nothing short of a catastrophe. Worse yet, the fleet's guns were likely trained not only on them, but also on the elusive ghost hand pirates, who might yet be their true target. Whitebeard's one good eye flicked toward the looming warships, cold fury burning in his gaze. He'd accepted defeat at Nethin's hands. Age had sapped his former strength, but he would not allow the Navy to press their advantage now. Without warning, cannonballs screamed down from the sky, aimed straight at him. Marco's instincts screamed to throw himself in the way, but before he could move, Whitebeard raised a massive arm. The single commanding sweep was all the order Marco needed. Hold your ground. The shots struck the ice around them with harsh cracks, spraying frost and shards in every direction. Marco forced himself to obey, heart pounding as each impact reminded him that this assault was only just beginning. A sudden eruption of power tore through the air, halting every cannonball in mid-flight before they all detonated in rapid succession. Did you really think you could claim my head so easily, Marine? You've got the wrong idea. I am Whitebeard. Whitebeard pivoted, his aura flaring like a storm. With a bellowing roar, he drove his fist forward. The force of the blow shook the sky, splintering the ice pack beneath him into jagged shards. Those ice fragments hurtled toward the marine warship, smashing its bow to kindling in an instant. Even now, in his advancing years and grievously wounded, Whitebeard's strength remained terrifying. The Marines had first-hand proof. Half their ship lay broken on the waves. Without warning, a beam of golden light flashed across the ice. Admiral Kizaru, whose gnarled nickname the Yellow Monkey spoke to his uncanny speed and eerie composure, appeared on the shore. He regarded the scene with unblinking calm, voice low and resonant. Whitebeard, you're far from the terror you once were. Surrender now, before any more lives are lost. But the old pirate simply laughed, clutching his fractured arm. Lives? Lives? You've lost all right to speak of life, Marine. Let's see how many you've got left to risk against me. With that, the two titans stood off on the ice, one a legendary pirate nearing his end, the other a fearless admiral, each ready to unleash the next wave of destruction. Nethin's voice dropped to a low growl as he stretched out his fingers. In the gathering glow around him, several laser-like beams shot forth through the air, straight at Whitebeard. "Yellow Ape!" Marco yelled, eyes blazing. In one swift move, he hurled himself in front of Whitebeard, intercepting the lasers with his own devil fruit powers. The Yellow Ape crashed onto the island's vast surface, and at that moment the Navy, already massing offshore, finally made their move, dispatching waves of warships toward Ice Island. "It's about time," Nethin murmured, watching the fleet's dark silhouettes ripple on the horizon. His eyes gleamed with anticipation. Before he could take another step, a slash of cherry-red light cleaved the ice at his feet. A blade of concentrated sword energy lunged toward him. Nethin snorted, thrust his hand into the rift of swirling air, and bang, stopped the crimson strike dead in midair. On the far edge of the clearing, Vice Admiral Momotu appeared, draped in his navy cloak. He stood perfectly still, sword held horizontally before him, as though the chilly wind followed his every motion. His aura alone spoke of a master swordsman. No, a great swordsman worthy of the world government's finest. Nethin's lips curved into a half-smile. He seldom practiced swordplay himself, but he recognized true skill at a glance. "A great swordsman in navy blues," he said coolly. "This should be interesting." In raw swordsmanship, you're nothing more than an average fighter, nowhere near the top. Nethin's voice was steady as he spoke the first half of the sentence. When he finished, however, a cool disdain laced his words. He curled his fingers through empty air, drawing scarlet blade energy into a writhing coil like a colossal python. The crimson aura spiraled tighter and tighter until it condensed into a small, glowing orb that hovered in his palm. With a flick of his wrist, the sphere shattered, vanishing in a burst of light. Even at his peak, Taudu's skill rivals that of Aokiji or Akira, and in pure offensive power, he may even surpass them. But today, facing Nethin at just 1/3 of his full strength, Taudu stands no chance. Taudu remained motionless, his gaze unblinking, as though he and his sword were one. Finally he spoke, his tone resigned. "Lord Nethin, I'm afraid we simply cannot contend with the Navy." Nethin sagged against the shattered bulkhead, his breaths ragged and shallow. Lafitte hovered nearby, cane poised, concern in his eyes as he took in the blood-soaked scratches crisscrossing Nethan's torso. "You're wounded," Lafitte said quietly. "Your strength is almost gone. Are you sure you want to keep fighting?" Nethan glanced at his hands, still trembling from the last clash. He straightened his spine with an effort and forced out a puff of air. "I'm fine," he insisted, though his voice cracked. "Just a few scratches." Across the ruined deck, Trafalgar gripped his demon knife by the hilt. Sweat and grime streaked his face, but his eyes burned with steady purpose. He nodded toward the distant smoke on the horizon. "They're still out there," he said. "The Whitebeard pirates haven't given up." Lafitte frowned, glancing between Nethan and Trafalgar. "So what do you propose?" Before an answer could form, the roar of cannon fire split the air. Marine ships thundered into the inlet, cutting off any hope of retreat. Amid the disciplined ranks strode Admiral Aokiji, his navy coat flapping like a banner. He raised a hand leisurely. "Ice Age," Aokiji announced. A shimmering frost rippled out from his palm in an instant. The deck beneath Nethan's feet cracked and frosted over. Cannon crews and pirates alike froze in half-formed motions, their bodies crystallizing like twisted statues. "Watch out!" cried Shiryu of the Rain, leaping skyward to escape the advancing freeze. A bolt of lightning arced from his fingertips, scattering drifting ice shards as he landed hard beside Nethan. The Marines scrambled to avoid Aokiji's ice, but the Admiral merely watched, expression impassive. Then he summoned a colossal orb of ice high above the battlefield. "Ice Ball!" he intoned. The sphere plummeted, a frozen meteor destined to shatter anything in its path. Nethan's heart pounded. Wounded or not, they had to act, and fast, or risk being swallowed by Aokiji's relentless winter. The figure of the green pheasant, Aokiji, flashed into the air, his eyes locked onto Nethan with icy calm. In a fluid motion, Aokiji's arms crystallized into towering blocks of ice and hurled themselves toward him. Nethan braced himself on the frozen plain. He drew back his fist and struck the first ice column dead on. A thunderous crack split the air as his punch shattered the onslaught into countless shards. The shockwave rebounded, driving straight back into Aokiji's frozen form. In an instant, the Admiral's body fractured into glittering fragments and tumbled down onto the glacier below. Aokiji lay silent, nothing but a scattering of ice shards marking where he'd stood. Nethan exhaled, his breath steaming in the frigid air, as the echoes of their collision faded into the stillness. Shiryu of the Rain stood on the frozen deck, half his body encased in frost, his cold eyes fixed on the spot where Nethan had driven Admiral Aokiji to his knees. He raised his sword and swung, unleashing a blade of biting wind. Wherever the sword cut, the air itself crystallized into a brilliant white line suspended in midair. Crack! Crack! Jagged shards of ice sprang up from the surface, only to meld back together the instant they formed. Aokiji met the attack by crossing his arms. The chilling energy raked against his ice-hardened skin, but it barely registered. After all, his devil fruit had turned his body into living ice. Cold-based assaults hardly slowed him. Shiryu's frost techniques, potent against most foes, counted for almost nothing against the Ice Admiral. On paper, Shiryu's ice affinity should have given him the upper hand against another ice user. But that edge only exists when both combatants start from the same footing. Shiryu of the Rain staggered back, every muscle in his body trembling with exhaustion. He'd been locked in a relentless duel for what felt like hours, and there was no way he could match Admiral Aokiji's raw, frosty power now. The air crackled as Aokiji narrowed his eyes and whispered, "Ice Arc Sickle," unleashing a sweeping, crescent-shaped blast of ice straight for Nethan. At the same moment, Momotu surged forward, his blade glowing with ki, and sent a second, razor-sharp slash hurtling toward Nethan from a distance. Before the keyblade could strike, however, Admiral Fujitora slammed his gravity blade staff into the ground. Gravity intensified around the incoming energy, instantly crushing it and sending the scattered fragments plummeting into a yawning crevasse below. Momotu scowled at Fujitora, chest heaving. Nethan shook out his right fist, dusted frozen mist from his sleeve, and turned his gaze to Taotu and Aokiji. "You really think you can take down two Yonko at once?" he scoffed, voice low and challenging. In the next heartbeat, Nethan blurred forward, faster than the eye could follow, and materialized directly in front of Aokiji. He drew back and unleashed a thunderous, straight-arm punch. Aokiji's eyes snapped open in alarm as he crossed his arms to block, but the impact shattered his icy armor in an instant. Chunks of frost exploded outward like shattered glass, and Aokiji was hurled back, wings of mist trailing him as he skidded across the snow. Seizing the moment, Shiryu of the Rain and the others pressed in alongside Nethan, their faces calm but deadly. Together, they surged toward the stunned Marines, determined to turn the tide of battle once and for all. The Ghost Hand Pirates and the Whitebeard Pirates had been locked in brutal combat for hours when the Marines finally intervened. A contingent of 3 vice admirals, Aokiji, Oriole, and Taotu, swept in, backed by battalions of naval elites. An alternate admiral with uncanny foresight accompanied them, predicting every move before it happened. The Marines' eyes were hard with determination. "Kill them," one officer barked. "They're exhausted. Now's our chance." With a thunderous clash, Marine and pirate forces collided. Sea spray flew as swords crossed and devil fruit powers flared. Though the Navy was tired from previous engagements, their leaders were among the fleet's strongest, and they meant to prove it. If they focused all their strength on either the Ghost Hand Pirates or Whitebeard's crew, they'd crush them utterly. In an instant, the battlefield descended into chaos. Cannons roared, haki clashed, and the cries of the wounded echoed across the waves. Neither side gave quarter. The Marines unleashed everything they had, well aware that once these pirates were defeated, the Navy would emerge unchallenged in these seas. Amid the carnage, one young pirate fought at the ear, Nethan, his dark hair plastered to his brow, eyes burning with defiance. He'd lost too much already to back down. As an admiral's fist came crashing toward him, he braced himself for the impact and let fly with a burst of haki-charged unches that shattered nearby timbers. The battle for dominance had reached its fever pitch. Now it was a test of wills. Could the Marines' raw power and strategic brilliance overcome the pirates' desperate ferocity? Or would Nithan and his comrades drive their enemies back into the depths? Only the roar of cannon fire and the clash of steel would decide. No matter how hard the Navy pressed its advantage, even unleashing its 4 top fighters, they couldn't hope to take on the Ghost Hand Pirates and the Whitebeard Pirates at once. Exhausted and wounded though he was, Nethan wasn't someone you could simply wear down. In fact, the only reason the Navy held any hope at all was that its 2 greatest foes were too busy tearing each other apart in a 3-way free-for-all. Amid the chaos, one figure stood out above all. The Ghost Hand Nethan, the pirate who had just felled Whitebeard himself and claimed the title of World's Strongest. He moved like a living weapon across the battlefield, unstoppable. Even admirals like Aokiji and Momotis could do no more than shadow him at the edges, desperately trying to contain the storm his power had become. Clang! Clang! Black energy rippled down Nethan's arm as he unleashed a barrage of punches on the master swordsman Taotu. Every blow met Taotu's blade in a shower of sparks. With a wild grin, Nethan pressed his assault, every strike a testament to his brutal dominance and a warning of the devastation still to come. Nethan drove a flurry of punches against Taotu's blade and, spotting an opening, slammed his hand into her chest with a twisting surge of force. Taotu staggered backward, her eyes flashing as she planted her feet and flared her aura in defense. The blow had winded her, her ribs ached, her breath came in short, sharp gasps. Yet she managed to steel herself. Without hesitation, Nethan closed the distance, reaching for her sword. Deprive a swordsman of her blade, and her power is effectively halved. If he could seize it, if he could capture Taotu alive, he'd claim not only her weapon but her unique techniques, deep hypnosis, psychic surgery, the so-called children's play fruits, all of which would bolster his own arsenal. But before his fingers could curl around the hilt, a bullet whistled across the clearing. It caught Nethan flush at the temple, snapping him off balance and forcing him to abandon his grab. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the slug spinning aside as though it were nothing more than a pebble. "Careful, Taotu," T-Dolphin called from the edge of the battlefield. "He may be hurt, but he's far from finished." Peach Rabbit stood nearby, her heart pounding as she watched Nethan's steely gaze. The contest was far from over, and everyone knew it. Nethan's relief at the T-Dolphin's timely rescue was short-lived. No sooner had the creature swept in than a diminutive pink-furred rabbit, Momotu, sprang from its open jaws. Handle it yourself, she snarled, unsheathing a slender blade and lunging straight at him. He barely had time to brace himself. Nethan recognized in an instant why the dolphin had never caught Tautu in all its past pursuits. With a thunderous clang, he blocked her opening strikes and drove a solid punch into the flat of her sword. The impact sent Momotu hurtling backward. She skidded across the ice and finally skated to a stop dozens of meters away. Nethan's eyes narrowed as he advanced, ready to press his advantage. Then a single, measured voice split the tumult. Stop! Though not shouted, the word carried an undeniable authority. Across the battlefield, combatants froze, blades poised mid-arc. Slowly, they lifted their heads, drawn toward its source. High on a jagged ice outcrop stood a lone figure, draped in a dark cloak. Silent and still, he surveyed the frozen plain below, his gaze sweeping over every warrior suspended in that sudden, uncanny hush. He stood before them, with a shock of crimson hair and an unassuming height. At first glance, his build was as ordinary as Nethan's, yet the air around him crackled with such intense energy that every heart pounded in response. It can't be! Why is he here? The moment his figure emerged, every face shifted in recognition. The old man with the white beard brightened, Aokiji and Yellow Ape stiffened, and Nethan's eyes narrowed in surprise. Red-haired Shanks, someone breathed. The third of the four emperors, the legendary red-haired Shanks, had finally arrived on the battlefield. Chapter 339, One Sword. On the frozen battlefield, three forces collided: the Navy, the Whitebeard pirates, and the Ghost Hand pirates. The Navy held the most advantageous position, poised to strike, but it was impossible for them to wipe out both pirate crews at once. Had the Ghost Hand and Whitebeard fleets joined forces, they could have overwhelmed the Navy in an instant. Of course, such an alliance was unthinkable. Then there was the matter of the red-haired. Marco stood atop a jagged spire of ice, his gaze fixed on the direction from which Shanks would appear. Nearby, Shiryu of the Rain slowly lowered his blade. Around them, fighters eased their stances, reluctant to make the first move. In a clash already teetering on all-out war, the mere arrival of the man with the red hair would shatter the balance and risk unleashing the greatest battle the seas had witnessed since the golden age of piracy. If Shanks stepped onto the ice, neither the Ghost Hand nor the Whitebeard pirates would stand a chance. Both crews' commanders were already pushed to their limits. Step by step, Shanks advanced across the ice in simple wooden clogs. He gave no roar, no dramatic display of strength, yet every footfall carried the weight of his reputation. Releasing Conqueror's Haki now was effectively a challenge to all three powers, and there could be no turning back from the bloody clash to come. Nethan stood motionless atop the ice, his posture calm yet imposing, eyes fixed on the approaching red-haired pirate. "Long time no see, red-haired," he called out in an even tone. Shanks slowed his stride as he came into view, taking in the man who'd once been a hunted fugitive in the West Blue. "Nethan," he replied, his voice quiet but edged with surprise. "The last time we crossed paths was in Shihai. You hadn't yet set foot on the Grand Line. You were still fighting desperately to escape the Navy's net. Back then, you and I were worlds apart." Nethan smiled faintly. 6 years can change a lot. Today, I stand among the four emperors. My power at sea surpasses anyone's. Even Whitebeard would struggle against me now. A ripple of astonishment ran through the onlookers. Whispers broke out. Meeting Shanks? When did that happen? Why had no one ever heard of it? Shanks regarded Nethan for a long moment before nodding thoughtfully. "Time does fly," he said. "But this place, what brings you here?" Before Nethan could answer, a voice cut through the tension. "Shanks." Admiral Aokiji stepped forward from the shadows, his icy gaze fixed on the red-haired captain. "What are you doing here?" Shanks met Aokiji's stare without flinching. Around them, the air crackled with anticipation, three great powers on the brink of collision, and two legendary captains once more face to face. The Navy may be hard-pressed to crush both the Ghost Hand pirates and Whitebeard's crew at once, but on paper, they still hold the upper hand. If the red-haired pirates join the fray, however, everything changes, and that's precisely the outcome the Admiralty dreads. Shanks came to a sudden halt and swept his gaze over the assembled officers. Aokiji, Momotu, Kizaru, Marco, Fujitora, Shiryu of the Rain, and the rest. His voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable edge. "There's no point in pushing this fight any further," he announced. "All you'll achieve is needless loss of life. And for what? Your navy gains nothing from this carnage. So tell me, what will you do?" Momotu's cold stare met Shanks's eyes without flinching. Shanks allowed his gaze to drift to Kizaru for a moment, then spoke again, quieter this time. "I'm here to end this war. Let it stop right now. Think carefully before you answer, Admiral." Kizaru, nicknamed the T-Dolphin, slid his hands into his coat pockets and studied Shanks from across the field. After a long beat, he spoke, his tone measured and sharp. "You want us to stand down and let these pirates roam free?" His words cut through the tense silence, and for an instant, the entire battlefield seemed to hang, waiting for the Navy's answer. C. Hapter. 12. The standoff on ice. The red-haired pirate's flagship ground gently against the ice, and in an instant, Vice Captain Ben Beckman and a squad of the crew's senior officers poured onto the frozen plain. Their measured, confident strides turned the chill wind even sharper. These were veterans at full strength, unbowed by battle. Across the field, Nethan, formerly known as Ross, stood motionless, hands clasped behind his back. He watched Shanks's men advance, his dark eyes betraying nothing of his thoughts. Behind him, the battered remnants of Marco the Phoenix's division and Vista the Rain Swordsman's team had just staggered in from a punishing 3-day struggle. In contrast, the red-haired pirates were still fresh, every man poised for action. Shanks stepped forward, his scarlet hair whipping in the icy gusts. He raised a calm hand, and the sudden stillness spoke volumes. "Hold your positions," he ordered, voice clear and unyielding. "I never intended to turn this into total war. There's too much at stake. If we press on, only more will die for no good reason." Nethan's jaw shifted slightly, but he remained silent. No one could read his expression, and Shanks's gaze flicked to him for a moment longer before returning to Beckman. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. Memories of Marineford surged up. How Shanks's timely arrival had forced Blackbeard to back off at the Navy headquarters, and how even the Marines had hesitated to pursue Whitebeard's scattered forces. Yet this frozen battlefield felt different. Here, both the red-haired pirates and the ruthless Blackbeard pirates loomed large, and neither side could simply walk away without risking everything they'd already sacrificed. Then Beckman nodded. At his signal, the red-haired pirates halted, forming a line across the ice. Opposite them, Nethan inhaled deeply, bracing himself against the cold and against the unknown that waited beyond Shanks's final warning. The tension on the deck was palpable. Neither Whitebeard nor Nethan had any intention of backing down, but a head-on clash between all parties would only invite disaster. Sensing this, red-haired Shanks stepped forward, his composure steady and unflappable. "Enough," Shanks declared, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "This ends now." His words hung in the air, stopping every fighter in their tracks. Had Shanks not appeared, admirals like Aokiji and the others would have pressed their assault on the Whitebeard and Ghost Hand pirates. But with Shanks here, an emperor himself, continuing the battle risked provoking him directly. None could be sure of Shanks's next move, and no one wanted to test that. Whitebeard's crew, too, was spent. Only Nethan still retained a fraction of his strength, barely a third of his peak power. The rest staggered on the brink of exhaustion. If this fight dragged on, not even the likes of Shiryu of the Rain or Phoenix Marco could guarantee survival. Nethan met Shanks's calm gaze. Red hair, cool confidence, undeniable power. Shanks embodied it all. Something in Nethan's chest tightened. He wouldn't yield, not after everything they'd fought for. Shanks inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging an unspoken challenge. In a heartbeat, Nethan's hand shot to the sword at his waist. Steel rang on steel, clang, as he drew his blade. The world seemed to slow. In the next instant, Nethan had vanished. When he reappeared, he was directly before Shanks. His sword glowed with a chaotic aura, swirling violet and black. With a roar, Nethan unleashed the strike. Time snapped back into motion as the twisted blade hurtled toward the red-haired pirate. Onlookers braced themselves, knowing they were witnessing the brink of calamity, and that Shanks's response would shape the fate of them all. Nethan's expression darkened the moment he drew his sword. His hand was already on the hilt before he even fully confronted Shanks, and in a blink, the two blades were raised to meet each other. Time seemed to slow as every onlooker held their breath. Inch by inch, the steel edges crept closer, until with a thunderous clang they collided. Sparks exploded in all directions, and a violent, twisting force shattered the ice beneath their feet. In an instant, fractures radiated outward for dozens of meters. Above them, the dark clouds split open like a gaping chasm. "Ghost Hand," one of Shanks's red-haired pirates gasped, eyes wide with alarm. The battlefield trembled. Would Nethin press onward in such an overwhelmingly hostile terrain? Even Kaido the Beast still held on to a shred of reason, and however reckless Nethin might be, he could never match Kaido's unbridled savagery. Beneath the warriors, the ice groaned and then collapsed in a cascade of cracks. Jagged ravines yawned open, spidering out beneath Nethin and Shanks as the frozen ground gave way. Nethin and Shanks froze in place, standing blade to blade. Remarkably, the ice directly beneath their feet held firm, untouched by the shock of their clash. But all around them, spanning tens of meters, the frozen sea had been shattered as if struck by a falling star, leaving a vast, jagged crater in its wake.